The morning Celine was sold, the kitchen still smelled like the bread she had baked at dawn. She had been up before the sun, the way she always was, measuring flour with the careful hands of someone who had learned early that nothing in life came without effort. The house was quiet then. Her brothers were asleep. Her stepmother was asleep. Even Lyra, the stepsister who slept in the room with the bigger window, the room that had once been Celine's before the arrangement changed, was asleep. Celine had stood in that kitchen alone, the way she stood in most rooms alone, and she had made bread because there was always someone who needed feeding, and that someone had never once been her. She was 22 years old. Her hair was the color of dark honey, though no one in that house had ever thought to say so. Her eyes were gray-green, like shallow water over stone. She was not small, and she was not fragile, though the people in her life had long ago decided she was both. She had a spine made of something harder than any of them had ever tested, but they had never tested it because they had never needed to. She was simply there, useful, available. The kind of person a family leans on until the leaning becomes invisible, becomes furniture, becomes fixed. Damon came into the kitchen at 8:30. He was her older brother by 4 years, and he had their father's wide shoulders and their father's easy smile and none of their father's goodness. He poured himself a cup of coffee without acknowledging that she had made it, and he stood at the window with his back to her, and he said, "We need to talk to you about something." Celine kept slicing the bread. "All right. Rael is coming down in a minute." "All right," she said again. She had learned, a long time ago, not to ask questions before she had to. Questions used energy. Questions created anticipation. It was better to wait and receive the information when it arrived, and deal with it then, with whatever was left of herself after the morning's work. Rael came down 7 minutes later. He was younger than Damon by 2 years and older than Celine by 2, which placed him neatly in the middle of everything, and responsible for none of it. He had their mother's narrower face, their mother who had died when Celine was 9, and whose name was spoken less and less with each passing year, until it had become a kind of myth, a woman remembered in the shape of her children, rather than in words anyone said aloud. Rael sat at the table, and he did not look at Celine directly, which told her more than anything either of them was about to say. "There's a situation with Lyra," Damon said. Celine placed the bread on the board and turned around. She leaned against the counter and crossed her arms, not in anger but in the way of a person bracing for weight. "What kind of situation?" Damon and Rael exchanged a glance. The kind of glance that had already made a decision, and was only now getting around to informing the person it affected. "Lyra owes a debt to the Alpha King's court," Rael said. He said it the way you say something you have rehearsed, carefully, with the rougher edges worn smooth. "It's a blood debt. You know what that means." Celine knew what it meant. Everyone in the territory knew what a blood debt to the Alpha King's court meant. It meant Lyra had done something significant enough to require significant repayment, and the court's version of repayment was never gentle. The Alpha King ruled 4 territories from his seat in the northern citadel, and his court did not ask twice for what it was owed. People who owed blood debts to the court either paid them or disappeared, and the stories of what disappearing meant were told quietly, in the kind of voice people used when they wanted to frighten children into obedience. "What did she do?" Celine asked. Another glance between her brothers. "That doesn't matter right now. It matters to me. Celine." Damon put his coffee cup down and turned to face her fully, and his expression was the one he wore when he had already run the numbers and found them acceptable. It was the expression of a man who had decided, and was now executing. "We've made an arrangement to settle the debt." She looked at him. She looked at Rael. Rael was studying the table that she had scrubbed 2 days ago because no one else was going to do it. "What arrangement?" she said, though her body already knew. The way bodies know things before the mind is willing to accept them. A cold settling behind the sternum, like a stone dropping into still water. "The court will accept a substitution," Damon said. "Someone to serve in Lyra's place. Not as a prisoner, not as a servant, as a ward. You'd have a room and food and—" "You sold me," Celine said. The words came out flat, not as an accusation and not as a question, as a simple statement of what was true, the way you state the time of day or the temperature outside. Damon's jaw tightened. "We arranged a placement. You sold me to the Alpha King's court to pay Lyra's debt." She uncrossed her arms. She picked up the knife she had been using for the bread, and she placed it very carefully in the sink, handle first, because even now she was not the kind of person who left knives where someone could get hurt. "When do I leave?" Rael looked up then. She thought she saw something in his face, something that was not quite guilt but was adjacent to it, the way a house fire is adjacent to warmth. He opened his mouth. 3 days, Damon said. "They're sending a transport." Celine nodded. She wiped her hands on her apron and she untied it and she folded it over the back of the chair where she always left it, and she walked toward the stairs. Celine, Rael's voice. She stopped but did not turn. It was the best option we had. She stood there for a moment. She thought about asking what other options they had considered. She thought about asking whether her name had come up first or last in the conversation, and whether either of them had pushed back before agreeing. She thought about asking what Lyra had said when she learned what the solution was going to cost. She thought about all of those questions and she let them go, one by one, like releasing birds she had been holding too tightly. "I'll need to know what I'm allowed to pack," she said, and she went upstairs. The 3 days passed the way the days in that house had always passed, which is to say they passed around her rather than including her. Her stepmother, a thin woman named Gloria with excellent posture and a talent for saying nothing while meaning everything, told her she could take one bag. One bag for 22 years of a life. Celine stood in her room, which was the smaller bedroom at the back of the house overlooking the garden she had planted and tended for 8 years, and she looked at her things with the steady eye of a person doing triage. She took her mother's ring. It was a simple silver band with a small blue stone, not expensive, worn smooth from years of being worn and then years of being kept in a box because wearing it felt like pressing on a bruise she hadn't fully healed from. She put it in the bag first. She took 3 changes of clothing, practical ones. She took the small notebook she had filled with recipes over the years, because it was the most complete record of the things she had made with her own hands and she was not willing to leave it behind. She took a book she had read 4 times and would likely read again. She took nothing that anyone in that house had given her, because she went through the list and found that no one had given her anything she would grieve leaving. Lyra came to her room on the second evening. She knocked, which was more courtesy than she usually offered, and she opened the door and she stood there in the doorway with her golden hair and her expression of a person who wants forgiveness more than they want to earn it. Lyra was beautiful in the way that the world rewarded, openly and without question. She was also genuinely warm in the way that made her beauty feel like a gift rather than a weapon. Celine had always understood the difference. She had also always known that warmth and fairness were not the same thing. "I wanted to talk to you," Lyra said. "Come in then." Lyra sat on the edge of the bed and folded her hands in her lap. "I didn't know they were going to do this. When I told Damon about the debt, I didn't think—" "What did you think?" Celine asked, not unkindly. Lyra was quiet for a moment. "I thought they'd find another way." "What other way?" "I don't know. Money. Negotiations. Something." Celine sat down across from her on the small wooden chair at the desk. She looked at Lyra's face, and she saw the truth there, which was that Lyra had told Damon about the debt and then stepped back and let him solve it, the way people do when they trust that someone will handle the difficult parts. The problem was that the difficult part, this time, had a name and a face and a bag packed with 1 change of clothing for each of 3 days. "I'm going to fix this," Lyra said. "When you get there, I'm going to find a way to get you out, I promise." Celine looked at her for a long time. "All right," she said. She did not tell Lyra that promises made from a place of guilt rarely outlasted the guilt. She did not tell her that she had already begun, quietly and without ceremony, to restructure every expectation she had ever held about who would and would not show up for her. She did not tell her any of this because it was not Lyra's fault that Celine loved her, and it was not productive to say true things that could not be taken back. She said all right, and she meant, "I hear you," and she let it be what it was. The transport came on the 3rd morning at 7 o'clock. It was a large vehicle, dark and unmarked, with 2 escorts in the formal gray uniform of the Alpha King's court. They were polite in the impersonal way of people performing a function rather than a cruelty. They asked for her name. They wrote it down. They asked if she had any questions about the process. She had approximately 40 questions about the process. She asked none of them. Damon walked her to the transport. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder and said, "You'll be fine, Celine. You're capable," as though capability were the relevant metric, as though the most important thing about this moment was a reassurance that she could handle it. She looked at his hand on her shoulder, and she thought about what it would mean to say the thing she was actually thinking, which was that she had spent the better part of her adult life being capable in the service of people who had never once worried about whether she was fine. She thought about what it would mean to say that. She said nothing. She got into the transport. She did not look back at the house as it pulled away. She had decided, somewhere in the 3 days of packing and waiting and being looked at with expressions she did not find useful, that she would not look back, not from stubbornness and not from anger. From a simple understanding that looking back at things that had not chosen you was a way of punishing yourself, and she had taken enough of that. The journey to the northern citadel took 4 hours. She watched the landscape change through the window of the transport. First the flat, familiar fields of the eastern territories where she had grown up, and then the long stretch of open land that belonged to no one and everyone, and then the foothills, and then the mountains, gray and enormous, and completely without opinion about anything. She found that restful. The citadel revealed itself slowly, the way large things do. First as a shape on the horizon that could have been a cloud formation. Then, as they drew closer, as walls, stone walls, very old, the color of the mountains behind them, as though the citadel had grown out of the rock rather than been built on top of it. Towers at the four corners, each flying a banner in deep navy blue, with a silver emblem she was too far away to read clearly. Gates that were already open, which meant they had been expected, which meant this was all entirely organized and official and done. She was a transaction that had been completed. The paperwork was filed. The escorts knew the route. The transport passed through the gate and into a courtyard that was larger than the entire block her house had stood on. Stone everywhere, old stone worn smooth by decades of boots, and at the center of it a fountain that had probably been beautiful once and was now simply permanent. The way things become when no one is actively caring for them and no one is actively letting them fall apart either. Just existing, just there. She was taken inside. The corridors were cold in the way that very old stone buildings are cold, holding the temperature of centuries in their walls. The escorts walked quickly and she matched their pace, her bag over her shoulder, her face arranged into the expression she had perfected over years of walking into rooms where she was not certain she was wanted. Neutral, attentive, giving nothing away that she hadn't chosen to give. They brought her to an antechamber, and they told her to wait. She waited. She sat on a straight-backed wooden chair and she looked at the room. High ceilings, a window too narrow to offer much light, a tapestry on one wall that showed a hunt scene. Very old, the colors faded to a kind of muted dignity. A table with nothing on it. Another chair across from hers, empty. She sat there for 20 minutes before the door opened. He did not walk into the room the way she had expected. She had built, over the 4 hours of the journey, a careful mental image of what the Alpha King would be. Something obvious. Something that announced itself immediately. She had imagined severity, perhaps, or the particular kind of power that expresses itself through deliberate coldness. What came through the door was a man. Tall, yes, and broad across the shoulders in the way of someone whose body had been built by years of actual use rather than deliberate cultivation. Dark hair, a face that was not easy to read quickly, the kind of face that required more than one look, and she was already on her second look before she had decided to take one. He was dressed plainly, which surprised her. Dark clothing, no insignia she could see immediately. Nothing that announced his rank except the way the two escorts straightened slightly when he entered the room. A small involuntary adjustment that told her everything about his position without his having to say a word. He looked at her. She looked back at him. His eyes were dark, somewhere between brown and black, and they were sharp in the way of someone who was always thinking about something other than what they were looking at, processing information on a level she couldn't quite access. He looked at her for 3 full seconds and she held his gaze, because she had decided a long time ago that she would not look away first from any room she had as much right to be in as anyone else. Then he looked at the escort standing to his left and he said, "Give her the documentation and show her to her rooms. She'll have the East Wing chambers." He said it without particular feeling, the way you say something you have already decided. It was efficient. It was impersonal. It was the instruction of a man who was managing a situation he had agreed to manage. He did not ask her name, though it was in the documentation. He did not say anything to her directly. He turned and left the room. She watched the door close after him. She sat with that for a moment, with the particular texture of being processed rather than greeted, of being an item on someone's list rather than a person in someone's day. She had felt it before, many times, in the house she had just left. She was experienced with it. She knew exactly what it felt like. What she was not prepared for was the split second before he turned away, when his eyes came back to her face for just a moment, the briefest unscheduled stop, and she saw something in them that was not on his list. It was gone before she could name it. He was gone before she could examine it. The escort handed her a folder of documents and led her toward the East Wing. She walked through corridors she would have to learn to navigate, and past doors she did not yet know, the rooms behind and through a part of the citadel that became warmer and slightly brighter as they moved deeper into it, as though the building had better intentions in this section than it had shown at the entrance. The East Wing chambers were 2 connected rooms, a main room with a window that looked out over a courtyard garden, and a smaller adjacent room with a wardrobe and a wash basin. They were clean. They were spare. They were more space than she had occupied in the house she had just left. She put her bag down on the table. She stood at the window and looked at the courtyard garden. Someone had planted lavender along the outer edge of it, a long time ago judging by the size of the plants, and it had spread and grown and filled the space in the way that things do when they are put somewhere that suits them and then simply allowed to continue. She pressed 2 fingers to the cold glass of the window. She did not cry. She had not cried in the transport, and she had not cried saying goodbye to the house, and she did not cry now, standing alone in a room in a citadel 4 hours from everything she had ever known, because crying required a particular kind of surrender she was not yet ready to make. Not to this place, not to this situation, not to the reality of what her brothers had decided she was worth. She would be fine. Damon had said so. She unzipped her bag and took out her mother's ring, and she put it on her right hand, the first time she had worn it in 2 years, and she felt the smooth weight of it settle around her finger, and she thought, all right. Here then, this is the new thing, figure it out. She opened the folder of documents and sat down at the table and began to read, because she was, above all things, practical. The documents told her that she held the rank of Ward of the Crown, a title with specific rights and specific limits, which were outlined in careful language over 3 pages. She had freedom of movement within the citadel and the grounds. She was not required to perform any labor beyond what she chose to perform. She would receive 3 meals per day from the main kitchen. She was entitled to use the library. She was to present herself in the main hall the following morning at 9 o'clock for an orientation to the citadel's structure and her place within it. At the bottom of the last page, in handwriting rather than print, as though it had been added after the document was already prepared, were 4 words. They said, "You are not alone." She read them twice. She could not determine whose handwriting it was. It was neat and controlled and told her nothing about the person who had written it, only that they had taken the time to add something that was not required, something that served no administrative purpose, something that was only and entirely for her. She put the document down. She looked at the lavender in the courtyard garden, swaying slightly, in a wind she could not feel through the glass. She thought about those 4 words for a long time. Then she got up, unpacked her 1 bag with the methodical care of someone settling in for the long term, and she went to bed in the first room that had ever been entirely her own. She did not sleep well, but she slept. That was something. The East Wing chambers had their own particular silence, a deep, old quiet that was different from the silence of her room in the house she had grown up in. That silence had been the silence of being ignored. This one was simply the absence of noise, and there was a difference, though it took her until 3 in the morning to understand what the difference was. One had weight, the other just had darkness. She was dressed and ready by 8:30. She stood at the window with the last of the night still retreating from the courtyard garden below, watching the lavender come back into color as the light grew, and she told herself the things she already knew. She was in an unfamiliar place with unfamiliar people. She did not know the rules yet. She would learn them. She was good at learning the rules of rooms she had not been invited to choose. The orientation was conducted by a woman named Adelaide, who held the title of court administrator, and wore it like a second spine. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled into a neat arrangement at the back of her head, and she had the manner of someone who had been professionally efficient for so long that warmth had become something she deployed strategically rather than offered freely. She took Celine through the relevant corridors and rooms of the citadel with the brisk competence of a woman who had done this before and would do it again and had somewhere else to be afterward. The citadel was larger than it had looked from outside, which was an unsettling discovery in the way that all discoveries of unexpected scale are unsettling. There were 4 wings around a central hall. The north wing housed the administrative offices and the council chamber. The south wing held the kitchens, the staff quarters, and what Adelaide described as the working rooms, where the daily operations of the court were managed. The west wing was private, which Adelaide communicated with a certain particular emphasis that told Celine it was where the Alpha King lived, and that this information was being given specifically so she would not wander into it. The east wing, Celine's wing, was where visiting dignitaries were traditionally housed, which was an interesting choice of placement for someone who had arrived as a debt settlement, though Adelaide did not comment on this, and neither did Celine. The library was in a room off the central hall, on the ground floor, with windows that ran from floor to ceiling along one wall, and let in more light than most of the rest of the citadel combined. Celine stopped in the doorway when Adelaide led her past it, and she looked at the shelves, which ran the full height of the room, and were filled with what appeared to be several centuries of accumulated reading, organized in a system she couldn't immediately decode but would clearly be worth learning. "You're welcome to use the library at any time," Adelaide said. "The collection is not cataloged in a way that most people find intuitive, but the system exists and it is functional." "Who organized it?" Celine asked. Adelaide paused almost imperceptibly. The king arranged the cataloging system himself, several years ago. Celine looked at the shelves again with this new information and found she was seeing them differently, which irritated her slightly, because she did not want to spend her first morning here being curious about a man who had received her like a line item in a budget meeting. She moved on. The main hall was where the court gathered for formal occasions, Adelaide explained, and also where general business was conducted in the late mornings on weekdays. Celine understood this to mean she might encounter the king there, and she filed the information away with the same neutral efficiency she had applied to everything else. The meal schedule was flexible for wards. She could eat in her rooms or in the smaller dining room adjacent to the kitchens, which was used by staff and long-term residents and was, according to Adelaide, less formal and considerably warmer than the main dining hall, both in temperature and atmosphere. By the time the orientation was complete, Celine had a map in her head of the parts of the citadel she was entitled to use, and a growing list of questions she had not yet asked anyone, and a clear sense that she was being given a great deal of latitude for someone who had arrived under the circumstances she had arrived under. She was thinking about this as she walked back toward the east wing, and she turned a corner in the north corridor and found herself very nearly walking into the king. She stopped. He stopped. They were separated by approximately 3 feet of stone corridor, and the morning light was coming through a narrow window above and slightly behind him, which meant she was looking up at him slightly, which she did not like because it was not the angle she would have chosen. He looked at her the same way he had looked at her in the antechamber, assessing, contained, as though the fact of her was information he was processing in real time and had not yet finished processing. She waited for him to say something. He said, "You found the orientation." "Adelaide found me," she said. "I simply came along." Something moved across his face. Not a smile exactly, something adjacent to a smile, happening somewhere behind his eyes rather than on his mouth. "Adelaide finds everyone eventually. It's something of a talent. She's very organized," Celine said. Yes. They stood in the corridor, and the silence was not the uncomfortable kind, or at least not entirely. It was the silence of two people who were both capable of silence and were therefore not under pressure to fill it immediately. He said, "Do you have questions about the arrangement?" She had questions about the arrangement. She had many questions about the arrangement, beginning with why he had accepted it and ending with what exactly the terms were that she hadn't been given time to read carefully the night before. She looked at him, and she chose the most relevant one. "The document said I hold the title of Ward of the Crown," she said. "I'd like to understand what that means in practical terms, not the official language, what it actually means." He was quiet for a moment. "It means you're under this court's protection. What happens inside these walls is under my authority, and my authority says you're not here as a prisoner, and not here as staff. You're here as a person with rights." She heard the words and she let them sit for a moment, and she thought about whether they were true, and came to the conclusion that she didn't know yet whether they were true, but they were what he was saying, and she would calibrate later with evidence. "All right," she said. He looked at her in a way that suggested he had expected a more complicated response. She did not offer one. He said, "If you have concerns about anything here, Adelaide is the appropriate first contact. If the concerns go beyond what Adelaide can address, you can request a meeting with me directly." He paused briefly. "Through the scheduling office, in the south wing." "Through the scheduling office," she repeated. "Yes." "In the south wing." "Yes." She nodded. He gave her a single brief acknowledgement of the conversation's end and walked past her, and she watched the corridor after he was gone and thought that this was, without question, one of the stranger situations she had ever been in. She had expected a tyrant. She had expected the kind of power that required everyone around it to perform submission. What she had found instead was a man who communicated in efficiently complete sentences and who had told a court administrator to use the exact words, "You are not alone," in documentation handed to a woman who had been sent here in lieu of someone else. She went to the library. She went because it was available to her, and because it was the first room in this citadel she had walked past, and felt something that was not quite longing but was in the direction of it. She pushed open the heavy door and she went in, and she stood in the morning light from those floor-to-ceiling windows, and she tipped her head back and looked at the shelves, the enormous, overfull, imperfectly organized shelves that reached toward the ceiling like something that had been growing for years. She began at the left side of the bottom shelf and she read spines. It took her 40 minutes to understand the cataloging system, which was not arranged by author or by genre or by any framework she would have predicted, but rather by something more like mood. Books that generated a particular feeling were grouped together, not the feeling they were conventionally supposed to generate, she realized as she continued, but the feeling that someone had actually had while reading them. There was a section she came to eventually that seemed to hold books connected by a quality of being difficult but rewarding, demanding and rich. Another section held books that she could only describe, from a sampling of their first pages, as restful. A third held books that were plainly adventurous in the conventional sense but were grouped here with books that on the surface had nothing in common, except that she could feel, sampling them, that they shared something in the quality of their forward momentum. It was an unusual system. It was also, she realized, a deeply personal one. Someone had read every book in this library and shelved it not by what it was but by how it felt. The king had arranged the cataloging system himself. She took a book from the difficult but rewarding section because it felt like the honest choice for where she currently was in her life, and she sat in one of the deep window seats in the morning sun, and she began to read. She was still there 2 hours later when she heard the door open. She did not look up immediately because she was at a particularly good moment in the book and because she had long operated on the principle that people who needed her attention would find a way to indicate it. A moment passed and no one spoke, and she looked up. The king was standing just inside the door of the library with a folder of documents under his arm and an expression on his face that she could not immediately categorize. He was looking at the shelf she had taken the book from. Then he looked at her. He said, "That section tends to cause trouble." She looked at the book and then at him. What kind of trouble? The kind where people read one and then immediately need to read another, and then it's 3 weeks later and they haven't done anything useful. She looked at him. He was entirely serious. She said, "That sounds like a reasonable use of 3 weeks. The thing happened again behind his eyes, not quite a smile but in the vicinity. He crossed to one of the work tables near the center of the room and sat down and opened his folder of documents, and she understood that he had come to work in the library, that this was a thing he did, and that her presence here was either unremarkable to him or he had decided to proceed as though it was. She returned to her book. He worked. They spent an hour in the same room without speaking. She found, at the end of that hour, that the quality of the silence between them was the same as it had been in the corridor. Not uncomfortable. Not charged with the particular tension of two people who are performing casualness, simply two people occupying the same space, each engaged with their own work, neither requiring anything from the other. She had never had that before. Not with her brothers, not with her stepmother, not with Lyra. Even in her own bedroom in the house she had grown up in, she had always been aware of the other people in the building, and aware that any of them might need something from her, and that awareness had made her spaces never entirely her own. Here, in this library, she was aware of the man across the room from her, and she felt no pull toward him, no obligation, no performance. She was simply reading her book, and he was simply working, and the room held them both without requiring anything of either. It was very strange. It was also, she realized, the most peaceful she had felt in recent memory. At the end of the hour he gathered his documents, and he stood and he looked at her. She looked up from the book. He said, "The smaller dining room is less formal," which was exactly what Adelaide had told her that morning, and she could not entirely determine why he was telling her again, unless it was because he thought she might find it useful to hear it from a different source, or unless it was something else. Something she was not going to examine this closely on her second morning here. Adelaide mentioned it, she said. "Right," he said, and he left. She sat with the book open in her lap for a moment after the door closed. Then she went back to reading. Over the following week she built a careful map of the citadel in her mind and in her understanding. And the map included not just the physical geography of corridors and rooms, but the social geography of who went where and when and why, who spoke to whom, what the underlying power structures looked like beneath the surface formality of the court. The court was larger than she had initially understood. There were advisors, senior and junior. There were administrative staff at various levels of the hierarchy. There were what appeared to be a small number of permanent residents who occupied a status similar to hers in terms of not being staff but not being visitors either. She learned their names carefully. A man named Philip who was perhaps 60, and had the bearing of someone who had once been important in a different context, and was managing his reduced circumstances with humor and reasonable dignity. A woman named Caroline, who was perhaps 30, and sharp in the way of a very intelligent person who had learned to be careful about how visible that intelligence was. A young man named Oliver who reminded her of no one she had known before, and who seemed constitutionally incapable of walking past a problem without trying to fix it, whether or not it was his problem to fix. They were all curious about her. She understood that. She was a new presence in a small social world, and she had arrived under circumstances that the court undoubtedly knew about in the way that courts know about everything. She handled their curiosity the way she handled most things. She was straightforward. She did not volunteer more than she needed to. She asked questions in return and listened to the answers, which people almost always appreciated more than they expected to be appreciated. Caroline was the one who said it directly, which Celine respected. They were in the smaller dining room on the fourth evening, and Caroline sat down across from her with a plate and no preamble and said, "You're Lyra Aldham's stepsister, the one they sent in her place." "Yes," Celine said. Caroline looked at her. "How are you doing with that?" "I'm figuring it out," Celine said. "That's a very composed way to say something terrible happened to you." Celine ate a spoonful of soup and thought about that. "Something happened to me," she said. "I'm still deciding on the adjective." Caroline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "For what it's worth, the king hasn't said anything about you to anyone here, which is notable because he normally makes things very clear very quickly. What something is, what it isn't, what it's for. He hasn't categorized you." Celine looked at her. "Is that significant?" "He's a very organized man," Caroline said. "Yes, I think it's significant." Celine thought about the library, about the cataloging system, about a man who had organized thousands of books by the feeling they gave him rather than by their titles. She thought about him sitting across from her at the work table in the morning light, doing his documents, and the quality of the silence between them. She did not say any of this to Caroline. She said, "Tell me about the court, how it works," the parts Adelaide didn't cover in the orientation. Caroline seemed to recognize this as a change of subject and accept it. She told Celine about the court. Celine listened, and she filed things away, and she thought about what it meant to be in a place where you hadn't been invited and hadn't been given a choice, and how you found the shape of yourself in a space that was not yours and had not been made for you. She thought about the lavender in the courtyard garden, how it had spread and grown and filled the space because the space suited it, not because it had been asked to or planned to or had anywhere else to be. She thought about that and she ate her soup, and she listened to Caroline talk about the court with the careful attention of someone who was doing the slow, patient work of learning to survive somewhere new, and somewhere, in the part of her she kept most private, the part that no transaction, and no arrangement, and no transport at 7 in the morning had been able to reach. Something that she did not yet have a name for was beginning, very quietly, to wake up. Celine had been in the Citadel for 12 days when she saw him do the thing she could not explain away. She had been walking back from the library in the late afternoon, taking the long route through the North Corridor because she had found that this corridor had better light at that hour, and she had been reading for 3 hours, and her eyes appreciated the change from the dim focus of a page. She was almost at the junction that would take her back toward the East Wing, when she heard voices ahead of her, around the corner, and something about the tone of one of them made her slow her pace. It was a man's voice, one of the junior advisors, she thought, a man named Garrett who had the particular quality of someone who had been clever for long enough that it had started to tip into cruelty at the edges. She had noticed him in the main hall earlier in the week, noticed the way he spoke to staff members, the particular kind of condescension that coated itself in pleasantness, and was therefore difficult to challenge directly. He was saying something to someone around that corner, and the tone of it was the low, amused tone of someone who believes they are being charming, and has not yet learned that charm and contempt are not compatible. Celine recognized the other voice after a moment. It was Caroline. She could not hear the exact words from her position, but she heard enough, the shape of what was being said, and the silence in Caroline's responses that was not agreement, but was not safe disagreement either. The silence of someone managing a situation carefully because the power differential in the room did not leave much room for anything else. Celine turned the corner. And so, from the other direction, arriving with the absolute stillness of someone who had always been going to arrive at exactly this moment, did the king. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a production of it. He said Garrett's name once, in the even, entirely certain tone of a man who does not need volume because volume is a tool for people who are not sure they will be listened to. And Garrett turned and saw him, and the color left Garrett's face in a way that told Celine everything she needed to know about how the king handled this sort of thing, and how reliably he handled it. What he said to Garrett after that was brief and quiet enough that she couldn't hear it from her position, but Garrett nodded once, twice, and then excused himself from the corridor with the efficient disappearance of a man who had suddenly found somewhere more important to be. Caroline stood with her back very straight, and her face composed in the careful way of someone who has been relying on their own composure as armor for long enough that the armor has become instinctive. The king said something to her. Celine was still too far away to hear it, but she saw Caroline's posture shift, fractionally, the way a held breath is released. Then the king turned and he saw Celine. He did not look startled, which she was beginning to understand was characteristic of him, this quality of never looking caught off guard, as though he had already accounted for every person who might appear in any given corridor at any given time. He looked at her for a moment with that particular steady gaze. She looked back at him. Neither of them acknowledged what had just happened. He continued down the corridor, and she continued in the direction she had been going. But she turned it over in her mind that evening, sitting in her east wing chambers with the window open and the cold night air coming through, and she thought about the specific thing he had done, which was not that he had intervened, though he had, and not that he had addressed it without theater, though he had, but that he had said something afterward to Caroline, something brief, and Caroline had released the breath she'd been holding. He had thought about Caroline after the problem was handled. He had thought about how Caroline felt. Celine had spent her life in rooms with people who thought about the problem and then moved on, who managed the incident and filed it away, who never thought about the person left standing in the aftermath of the incident. She had been that person, standing in the aftermath, more times than she had kept count of. She sat with that for a while. She did not decide anything based on it. She was not, she told herself firmly, in the business of revising her understanding of a man she had known for 12 days, based on a thing she had seen from 20 feet away in a corridor. She was practical. She was careful. She had learned the cost of deciding too quickly that someone was better than they had yet earned the right to be called. But she sat with it. The following morning she went to the main hall, because the documents had told her that the court's general business was conducted there on weekday mornings and she had been avoiding it in the instinctive way she avoided rooms she didn't know yet. But she had been here for nearly 2 weeks and she was not, she had decided, going to keep avoiding things. The main hall in daylight was different from how she had imagined it in the abstract. It was large, yes, with the high ceilings she had come to expect from every room in this citadel, and the dark stone that held its temperature regardless of what the seasons were doing outside. But it was also populated, and the population had a quality she hadn't expected, which was engaged. People were working here. Real work, actual work. Reports being reviewed and maps being discussed, and 2 advisors in the far corner who appeared to be having a productive disagreement about something she couldn't hear from the door. She found a place near one of the windows where she was not in anyone's way and she simply watched, because watching was how she learned, and she had never yet found a room she couldn't eventually understand if she paid enough attention to it. He was at the center of the hall, standing at one of the long tables that was covered in maps and documents, speaking with a senior advisor she recognized as being named Edmund, a tall, angular man with an academic's distraction and an administrator's precision. They were looking at something on the map together. The king was pointing at a section of what appeared to be a territorial boundary, his finger moving along it, and he was speaking in the low, clear register he used for everything, and Edmund was listening with the focused attention of someone who had been in enough rooms with enough decision-makers to know the difference between a man saying things and a man saying things that matter. Oliver appeared at Celine's shoulder from nowhere, which was the sort of thing Oliver did, arriving in places as though he had been there slightly longer than you had noticed. "You came to the hall," he said, pleased about this in the straightforward way he was pleased about most things. "I was told business is conducted here on mornings." "It is. You look like you're studying for something." "I am," she said. "Everything." Oliver followed her gaze across the hall to where the king was still in conversation with Edmund. "He's been here since before anyone else this morning," Oliver said, in the tone of someone reporting a fact they consider relevant. "He's usually the first one in, and the last one to leave. Not for show, he just works a lot." "What was he doing before he was the king?" she asked. Oliver gave her a look that said this was not a question most people asked. Then he said, "He was in the Eastern Territories for 5 years, in some sort of official capacity, before his father died and he came back to take the seat. What exactly he was doing there, nobody here seems entirely sure. He doesn't talk about it." She looked at him across the hall. She thought about a man who had spent 5 years in the Eastern Territories, which was where she was from, where Lyra had accumulated her debt, where the landscape was flat and familiar, and nothing like the gray stone mountains around this citadel. She thought about the document at the bottom of the papers she'd been given on the first night, the 4 handwritten words that she had read twice and had not been able to put down. "He's very private," she said. "Private is one word," Oliver said. "Some people use other ones." "What words do you use?" Oliver was quiet for a moment. "I think he carries things carefully," he said. "Things he thinks are his to carry." He paused. "Which isn't always the same as things he should be carrying alone." She looked at him sideways. "That's a perceptive thing to say." "I have my moments." Across the hall, the king finished his conversation with Edmund, and straightened and turned, and his gaze swept the room in the automatic way of someone who catalogs space by habit, and it landed on her. For a moment, nothing in his expression changed. She was simply in his line of sight. Then he looked at the shelf she was standing near, which held 2 rolled maps and a stack of documents that appeared to be older, and he looked back at her with something that was not quite a question, but contained the elements of one. She did not look away. He returned to the table and his work. That afternoon she went to the courtyard garden. She went because the lavender was there, and she had been looking at it from her window for 12 days, and she wanted to be near it rather than above it. She went through the small stone door she had identified as the garden entrance, and she came out into air that was colder than she'd expected but clean in the way of outdoor air that has not been filtered through corridors of ancient stone, and she stood there and breathed it for a moment. The garden was larger than it looked from the window. The lavender ran along 2 sides of it, old and tall, and there were other things growing that she recognized. Winter rosemary, still green and sharp-smelling, and a bed of something that had died back for the season but whose stems told her what it would be in spring. In one corner, a stone bench, worn smooth, facing the direction of the afternoon light. She sat on the bench. She sat there for a while with the cold coming through her coat, and the smell of rosemary and old lavender around her, and the sound of nothing in particular, which was its own kind of gift. A door opened on the other side of the garden. She did not hear footsteps immediately, just the door, and then a silence that told her whoever had come out was standing still. She did not turn around. Then, because she was who she was, she said, without turning, "There's room on the bench." A pause, then footsteps. Then he was beside her, sitting on the bench, looking at the direction she was looking, which was at the lavender and the afternoon light behind it. He said nothing. Neither did she. They sat there for several minutes, and the cold was sharp, and the lavender swayed slightly, and the light moved the way it does in the late afternoon, with that particular urgency of a thing preparing to leave. Then he said, "You know the Eastern Territories." It was not a question, not really, though it had the grammatical shape of one. "I grew up there," she said. "I know." A pause. "I was there, some years ago, near the western edge of the territory, mostly." She thought about Oliver's words. 5 years, doing something no one here quite knew. "What were you doing there?" she asked. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer, and she was already accepting that, already moving on from the question internally, when he said, "Learning what I would need to know, before I came back here." She sat with that. "Was it useful? What you learned?" He said, quietly and without drama, "More than I expected, and not in the ways I expected." She thought about asking him to explain. She thought about pushing on the edges of that answer. She decided not to, because she recognized the quality of something that was being offered carefully, in pieces, by someone who did not give pieces easily. "The rosemary is very old," she said instead. He looked at the rosemary. 30 years, at least. "Someone must have planted it before you were here." "My mother," he said. He said it simply, without particular weight, but with the care of a word that had weight and knew it. Celine looked at the rosemary with new attention. She had good taste. "She did," he said. They sat there until the light was completely gone from the sky, and the cold became the kind that required a decision about staying or leaving, and then he stood, and she stood, and they walked back inside through different doors, and she thought about the rosemary that his mother had planted 30 years ago, still growing, still green, still sharp and alive in the winter cold. She thought about what it meant to plant something and not be there to see it grow. She thought about what it meant to come back to a place and find it growing. She went to the smaller dining room and ate dinner with Caroline and Oliver and Philip, and Caroline was in a better mood than she had been in 2 days, and Oliver had fixed something in the administrative corridor that no one had asked him to fix but everyone was grateful for. And Philip told a story about a negotiation he had been involved in 20 years ago that ended with a goat and an overturned boat, and required no explanation of why he was telling it, because it was simply very funny. And Celine laughed at it, and the sound of her own laughter was slightly surprising to her, the way sounds are surprising when you haven't heard them in a while. She was, she thought, walking back to her chambers in the east wing. She was figuring it out. She stood at her window and looked at the courtyard garden, which she could no longer see clearly in the dark but whose shape she now knew well enough to see with her eyes closed. And she thought about a man who catalogued books by how they made him feel, and who had spent 5 years in a flat territory she had grown up in, learning things he hadn't expected to need, and who sat in cold gardens without being asked, and said almost nothing, and somehow left the air around him quieter than it had been. She pressed her hand flat against the glass. "You are not alone," said the handwriting she hadn't been able to attribute. She was still not certain what to do with that. But she was beginning, slowly, without ceremony or decision, to believe it. The letter from Lyra arrived on a Tuesday. Celine recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she had even fully registered that there was an envelope. The careful, slightly over-rounded letters that Lyra had been writing since she was a child, the ones she had never quite grown out of, as though she had found a handwriting she liked and decided to keep it permanently. Celine turned the envelope over in her hands twice before she opened it. Adelaide had brought it to her at breakfast in the smaller dining room, placed it beside her plate without comment in the manner of someone who dealt in other people's correspondence without developing opinions about it. Celine waited until Adelaide had left before she opened it. The letter was long. 3 pages, in that same rounded hand. Lyra wrote the way she spoke when she was nervous, in long, spiraling sentences that began in one place and arrived somewhere else before circling back, and reading it was something like walking a complicated route and finding yourself more or less at the starting point, slightly breathless. The beginning was apology. Lyra was sorry. She was deeply sorry. She had not known what Damon was going to do, and she had not known that the arrangement was going to be Celine, not specifically, and she wanted Celine to understand that she had wept when she found out. Real tears, Lyra wrote, which was a strange thing to specify, but which was also entirely Lyra, who understood that the credibility of an emotion was something you sometimes had to argue for. The middle was news from home, which is to say from the house that Celine had grown up in, which was not really her home but had been her address for 20 years. Lyra wrote about Gloria, the stepmother, and the state of the kitchen garden that Celine had tended, and a neighbor who had said something to rail at the market. She wrote about Damon's plans for a business venture that Celine suspected would go the way his other plans had gone, which was forward with confidence and sideways in execution. She wrote about the small, ordinary texture of life in that house, which was clearly still continuing without Celine in it, the way life does. The end was a promise. Lyra was going to fix this. She had said this in person the night before Celine left, and she said it again here in her rounded letters, with more specific intention this time. She was going to speak to people. She had contacts. She knew someone who dealt with the Alpha King's court, and she was going to find a way to renegotiate. Celine should not give up hope. Celine folded the letter and put it in the pocket of her jacket. She finished her breakfast. She thought about what Lyra's letter made her feel, and the answer was complicated in the specific way that things involving people you love and who have failed you are complicated. She loved Lyra. She had always loved Lyra with the specific and somewhat exhausted love of someone who has watched a person they care about make a series of decisions that the caring person would not have made, and continues caring about them anyway. Lyra was warm and lovely and genuinely remorseful, and also, Celine knew from long experience, someone whose intentions were considerably more reliable than her follow-through. Lyra was going to fix this. Lyra had said that, and Celine believed that Lyra believed it, with the full, sincere weight of someone who had not yet encountered the specific obstacles that would require the specific effort. She believed that Lyra, right now, sitting in the house with the kitchen garden and the neighbor at the market and Damon's new plan, felt the intention with great conviction. She also knew, in the quiet, practical part of herself, that this conviction had a shelf life. She did not say this to anyone. She put the letter in the drawer of the small desk in her East Wing chambers that evening, alongside the recipe notebook and the book she had carried from home, and she went to the library. The man who was there when she arrived was not Oliver, and not the king, and not Caroline. He was someone she hadn't spoken to before, a senior advisor named Marcus who had the particular quality of someone who had been in their current position for so long that they had begun to merge with the furniture, not invisibly but organically, as though he had grown there, and the room had accommodated him. He was at the table near the window, the one she had thought of since the first morning she had seen it in use, as the king's table. He looked up when she came in. "Ward Celine," he said, which was how most of the senior staff addressed her, and which she had accepted as the operational form of her title, without particularly warming to it. "Advisor Marcus," she said, with the same neutral tone. She went to her section of shelves and began looking for the next thing she wanted to read, and Marcus went back to his work, and they occupied the room with the same comfortable mutual disinterest that she had found was the default register of the Citadel's residents when there was no specific business between them. She had come to appreciate this. The house she had grown up in had a tendency toward unnecessary interaction, the kind where someone would come into a room she was working in and tell her things she had not asked to know and require responses she had not asked to give. The Citadel's default of leave each other alone until there is a reason to speak was, to her, a kind of kindness. She had found a book and settled into the window seat and been reading for perhaps 40 minutes when she heard the door and looked up. The king came in. He saw Marcus first, which was natural given where Marcus was sitting, and he exchanged a few words with him, something to do with a report that was due on Thursday, and then he looked around the room in that habitual scanning way, and he saw her. He paused for barely a breath. Then he said, "To the room generally, and to her specifically. Adelaide mentioned a letter arrived from the Aldham family this morning." It was not a question. It was also not a statement that required a response. It occupied a careful middle ground between the two. "From Lyra," she said. "How is she?" She looked at him. It was an interesting question, not because it was complex, but because he was asking about the person who had put Celine here, rather than about the content of the letter in a way that might have implied concern for Celine's response to it. It was a neutral question, carefully so. "Well," Celine said, appropriately guilty. "Making plans." "What plans?" "To renegotiate the terms," she said. "To find a way to revisit the arrangement." He said nothing for a moment. He moved to the other work table, not the one Marcus was using, not the one she thought of as his, and he set down the book he had brought with him. "And you?" he said. "What do you think of those plans?" She thought about Lyra's rounded letters, and her good intentions, and the neighbor at the market. She thought about the shelf life of conviction. "I think Lyra means everything she says at the moment she says it," she said carefully. "I think intention and action are different things, and I think I'm going to stop organizing my present around an outcome I have no control over." He looked at her with the steady, unhurried attention she was beginning to understand was not surveillance, but genuinely the way he looked at things he was trying to understand. "That's practical," he said. "I tend to be." "I know." He sat down with his book. "It's notable." She turned back to her own reading, and the room was quiet, and Marcus finished his work and left after another 20 minutes, and then it was just the two of them and the afternoon light through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She read. He read. The light moved. At some point she became aware that he was not reading, not because he had made any sound or movement, but because the quality of the silence had shifted very slightly, the way it shifts when someone stops being engaged with what they're engaged with, and becomes engaged with something else. She kept her eyes on her page. He said, "Did she tell you about the debt, what Lyra owes, what the circumstances were?" She turned a page. She didn't know. "Do you want to know?" She considered this. "I think I might need to know eventually. I don't know if now is the right time." He accepted that with a small sound that was not quite agreement, and not quite acknowledgement, but was something in between. Then he said, "It wasn't malicious. What Lyra did. It was careless in a way that had consequences she didn't foresee." Celine looked up from her book. He was looking at his book, or in the direction of it. "I'm telling you because I think it matters. She's not a bad person who did a deliberate thing. She's a person who didn't think ahead far enough and then someone else paid for it." Someone else. He did not say Celine. He did not need to. "That's very measured of you," she said, "to tell me that." "It's accurate," he said. "Measurement is just accuracy applied consistently." She sat with that. She thought about Lyra and carelessness, and the specific kind of damage done not by cruelty but by the absence of thinking far enough ahead, and she thought about the letter in the drawer in her East Wing chambers, and she thought about her brothers who had applied their considerable capacity for problem-solving to a problem whose cost they had simply decided was acceptable for someone else to pay. She said, "The careless thing Lyra did it affect anyone beyond the court?" He looked at her directly now, briefly. "It was resolved. By you." He said nothing, which was itself a kind of yes. She looked at him for a moment. "You spend a lot of time resolving things that other people have made careless," she said. Something crossed his face that she had not seen there before. Not the thing behind the eyes that wasn't quite a smile. Something older than that, something that had been there before the not quite smile and would be there after, something that knew the weight of exactly what she had said and was not sure whether to acknowledge it or put it back. He said, "It comes with the position." "No, it doesn't," she said. "It comes with the person." The silence that followed was different from the other silences between them. It had texture to it. Something in it that was still and a little held. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything. And then the clock in the hall outside made the sound it made on the hour, and the moment passed, dissolved back into the ordinary light and the ordinary room. He returned to his book. She returned to hers. Lyra arrived at the Citadel 3 weeks after her letter. She came on a cold morning, announced ahead of time, visiting in the capacity of a family member of the ward, which was a category the court's administrative documentation apparently accommodated. She arrived in a private vehicle with 2 bags, and the particular bright-eyed energy of someone who had been building momentum towards something for 3 weeks, and was now here, and ready to execute it. She came to the East Wing chambers and she stood in the doorway and she took in the room and she took in Celine and she opened her arms and Celine walked into them because regardless of everything, she was the person in this citadel that Celine had known longest, and the smell of her hair was the smell of the house with the kitchen garden and the neighbor at the market, and you cannot spend 20 years alongside someone and not feel, even in complicated circumstances, the specific warmth of familiarity. They sat across from each other at the small table in Celine's main room. Lyra looked around the chambers. She was taking them in with an expression that Celine recognized as Lyra calibrating her guilt to the evidence in front of her. The room was adequate. It was clean and spare. It was more space than Celine had had at home. "It's not terrible," Lyra said, with the particular relief of someone who had been afraid it would be. "No," Celine agreed. "It's not. Are they treating you properly? The staff, Lyra. "Yes." "I'm all right," Celine said. "I've found the library. I've found people to eat dinner with. I have more time to think than I've had in years." A pause. "I'm figuring it out." Lyra's face did the thing it did when she was receiving information she had been prepared to feel worse about. The specific fractional release of attention she had been carrying. She reached across the table and took Celine's hand. "I came to help. I have a contact who knows the court's negotiations secretary. I think if we can get the terms looked at again, we might be able to find a way." "Lyra." She stopped. Celine looked at her with the steady, clear attention of someone who has been thinking about this for 3 weeks and has arrived somewhere. "I know you want to fix this. I know you mean it. And I love you for meaning it." Lyra squeezed her hand. "But I want you to understand something," Celine said. "I'm not asking you to stop. I'm not telling you the situation is good, because it isn't. I'm telling you that I'm not standing in a burning building waiting for someone to carry me out. I'm standing in a complicated place and learning it, and if there is a way out that comes with your help, I will be grateful for it. And if there isn't, I am going to be fine." Lyra was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes were bright. "You've always been stronger than any of us," she said softly. Celine shook her head. "I've always had fewer people to lean on," she said. "Those are not the same thing." Lyra was still for a breath. Then she nodded, slowly, the nod of someone receiving something they know is true, even though it sits uncomfortably. They ate dinner that evening in the smaller dining room. Oliver appeared at the table with the cheerful inevitability of Oliver, and Lyra lit up at him immediately in the way she lit up at most warm and approachable people. Caroline came later and was politely watchful in the way Caroline was always watchful. Philip told another story. And the king came through the smaller dining room at the end of the evening, passing through on his way from one part of the citadel to another, and he stopped for a moment at the edge of their table and he looked at Lyra, who looked back at him with the particular expression of someone who is acutely aware of what they owe a person. He said, "Miss Aldham, I hope the journey was comfortable." Lyra said, "Thank you for having me, Your Majesty," in the careful voice of someone being very precise about their manners. He looked at Celine then, the briefest look, the kind that could have been inventory and was not inventory. Then he continued through the room and out. Lyra looked at the door after he left. Then she looked at Celine. She said nothing out loud, but Celine knew Lyra's face the way you know the faces of people you have lived beside for 20 years, and she saw the question forming in it, and she said, very quietly, "Don't." Lyra closed her mouth. She looked, Celine thought, like someone who had expected to arrive at a burning building and found instead something considerably more complicated, something she did not yet have the right category for. She stayed 3 days, and she was warm and full of good intentions. And when she left, she hugged Celine for a long time in the courtyard, and she said again that she was going to fix this. And Celine said that she knew, and held her, and breathed in the familiar smell of her hair. And when the car had taken Lyra away through the citadel gates and the courtyard was empty, Celine stood there for a moment in the cold and she thought about the question she had seen forming in Lyra's face, the question she had not let her ask. She thought about it carefully and honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. Then she went inside. She did not have an answer yet, but she realized, thinking about it, and that was a different thing from not thinking about it at all. The document was not where it was supposed to be. She had gone to the library for a particular reference book that Marcus had told her was on the third shelf of the eastern wall, a historical record of territorial agreements that she had been curious about after a conversation with Caroline about the court's administrative history. It was not there. The space where it should have been, based on the cataloging system she had now fully understood, held instead a folder of loose papers that had clearly been placed there temporarily and then forgotten. She picked up the folder to move it out of the way, and a page slipped from between the others and fell to the floor, face up. She almost didn't read it. She bent to pick it up with the automatic reflex of someone tidying a space, and she had already glanced at it by the time she had the intention not to read things that weren't addressed to her. But the words she had already read in that glance didn't release her, and she stood there with the paper in her hand and she read it properly. It was a court administrative document, the kind that recorded decisions made in official proceedings. The heading identified it as a record from 8 weeks ago, dated approximately 3 weeks before she had arrived at the Citadel. The language was the dense, formal language of official documentation, but she had been reading the Citadel's documents for weeks now and she had learned to translate it relatively efficiently. What it said, stripped of the formal language, was this: that the blood debt owed by Lyra Aldham had been resolved through diplomatic negotiation between the court and the Eastern Territories representative, and that the terms had been agreed and would take effect within a period of 30 days. 30 days, beginning 3 weeks before she had arrived. She stood very still. The debt had been resolved. Before she arrived, before her brothers had made their arrangement, before any transport had come for her at 7 in the morning on a cold day with her one bag and her mother's ring. The debt was already being cleared when Damon and Rael sold her. She read the document a second time, slowly, in case she had misread something, in case the formal language had led her to a wrong conclusion. She had not. The conclusion was the same the second time. She put the document back in the folder. She put the folder back in the space where the reference book should have been. She stood at the shelf with her hand still on the folder's edge, and she thought about what she had just read, and what it meant, with the particular steadiness of someone who has been surprised by enough things that surprise no longer lands the same way it once did. Her brothers had sold her, that was still true. But the reason they had given for selling her, the blood debt, the urgent necessity of the arrangement, had already been on its way to resolution. Whether they had known that was a separate question, a question she did not yet have enough information to answer. But the fact of it was there in the document in the folder on the shelf, fixed, official, dated 3 weeks before her arrival. She found the reference book she had come for on the next shelf over, where it had been placed by someone who had been close but not precise. She took it to the window seat and she sat down and she opened it, and she did not read it. She sat there and she thought about her brothers, and she thought about Lyra, and she thought about the transport at 7 in the morning and Gloria's instruction about one bag, and she thought about the stone floor of the corridor outside the antechamber where she had first arrived, and the way it had felt to sit in that room alone for 20 minutes waiting to be processed. She was not surprised by her brothers. That was the first thing she understood, going through it carefully. She was not surprised that Damon had found the shortest line between a problem and its solution, and walked it without spending much time on the terrain either side of the line. She was not surprised that Rael had let him. She had loved her brothers in the way you love people who are insufficient for what you need, but are still, technically, your brothers, and she had not ever expected more from them than they had ever given her reason to expect. What she was, she realized, as she sat with the unopened book in her lap, and the cold winter light coming through the window, was tired. Not newly tired, old tired, the kind that had been accumulating for years and had not had a moment to be recognized as tired, because there had always been something else to do, something to manage, someone to manage it for. The kind of tired that did not feel like exhaustion but like the memory of exhaustion, like your body carrying something that has been carried so long it no longer registers as weight because it has simply become your posture. She sat with it. After some time she opened the reference book and she read it, because she was there and it was in her hands and she had come looking for information, and the information was still valid regardless of what was happening inside her chest. The book was a record of territorial agreements going back approximately 80 years, and it was dry in the way that historical administrative records are dry, which is to say mostly dry but with occasional moments where the human fact of what was being described broke through the formal language and was briefly, startlingly real. She read it for an hour. Then she went back to her chambers and she sat at the small desk, and she took out a piece of paper, and she wrote a letter to Damon. It was not a long letter. She was not good at performing things she didn't feel, and she did not currently feel the kind of anger that produced long letters with extensive sentences. She felt the kind of clarity that produces short ones. She asked him a simple question. She asked him whether, at the time he made the arrangement with the court, he had been aware that Lyra's debt was already in the process of being resolved through diplomatic channels. She folded the letter and addressed it, and put it with the outgoing correspondence that Adelaide collected from the East Wing each morning. Then she went to dinner. She was quiet at the table that evening, in a way that Caroline noticed, and Oliver noticed, and Philip, who noticed most things through the particular attentiveness of someone who had been around long enough to understand that quiet people are almost always thinking something worth hearing, also noticed. None of them asked. She was grateful for that. She was beginning to understand that this was one of the consistent qualities of the people she had found in this place, the capacity to see something and not immediately reach for it. The king was not at dinner. He often ate in the West Wing in the evenings, or was simply elsewhere. She had learned not to track his presence or absence as information relevant to her. She had been doing well at this, by and large, some evenings better than others. The following morning she went to find Marcus. Marcus was in his office in the North Wing, which was a room she had not been to before but which was easy to find because everything in the North Wing was organized with the same consistent logic that she had come to associate with the king's administration generally. She knocked. Marcus called her in. He was at his desk and he looked up at her with the mild surprise of someone who has few unexpected visitors and treats each one as a point of curiosity. "Ward Celine," he said. "Sit down." She sat. "I have a question about a document," she said. Marcus set down his pen. "What document?" It was in the library, in a folder that had been misfiled, a record of a court proceeding from 8 weeks ago, regarding the resolution of a blood debt. Marcus was very still for a moment, then he said, "You found that?" "I wasn't looking for it," she said. "It fell out when I moved the folder." He was quiet. He picked up his pen and set it down again. "That document was filed in the wrong location because it was never intended to be accessible to general residents," he said. "It was supposed to be in the restricted administrative records." "I understand," she said. "I'm not asking about where it was filed. I'm asking whether what I read is accurate, whether the debt was being resolved before I arrived." Marcus looked at her with the expression of a man who has been in enough delicate situations to know that the delicacy of a situation does not change the nature of a direct question. "Yes," he said. "The resolution was in process. It would have been completed within the 30-day window." She nodded. She had known this, but hearing it confirmed was its own thing. "Did the king know that when he accepted the arrangement with my brothers?" Marcus looked at her steadily. "Yes." "Then why did he accept it?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she understood this was not unwillingness to answer, but the particular pause of someone choosing their words with great care. Then he said, "Because your brothers were not the only interested parties. There were other courts, other interests, who had become aware of the debt and of you, and of the specific value of an unclaimed young woman, with no formal protective status, who could be drawn into an obligation by whoever secured the agreement first." He paused. "The king moved quickly, and under terms that guaranteed your specific rights and standing, before any of those other arrangements could be made." She sat with that. The room was quiet. Outside the window of Marcus's office she could see a section of the courtyard she didn't usually see from her own rooms, a different angle of the same stone, and a corner of the garden where the old lavender met the wall. "He protected me," she said, not as a conclusion, and not as gratitude. As a statement of what was true that she was currently in the process of receiving. "Yes," Marcus said. "By accepting an arrangement that wasn't necessary. By accepting it before arrangements that would have been considerably worse could be made." She thought about this. She thought about a man who had moved quickly and precisely to place a protective label on a woman he had never met, using the machinery of a court debt that was already resolving itself, because the alternative was that someone less careful got there first. She thought about the handwriting at the bottom of the documents. 4 words, not administrative language, not formal language, something written at the end, after the document was done, addressed to her specifically, by hand. She stood up. "Thank you, Marcus." "Ward Celine," he said, in the tone of a man who is about to say something he has decided needs saying. "The king does not know that you found that document." She looked at him. "I'm not suggesting you should tell him," he said, "or that you shouldn't. I'm telling you so that you have the full picture." She nodded. "I appreciate that." She walked back through the North Wing corridor, and she thought about what she was going to do with the full picture, and the answer she arrived at, after the length of the corridor and a turn and the junction that led back toward the East Wing, was that she was going to sit with it first. She was going to sit with it the way she had sat with the letter from Lyra, the way she had sat with the document itself. She was going to let it be true and let it settle, and then she would know what to do. She went to the library, because the library was where she went when she needed the particular kind of quiet that let her think. The king was already there. He was at the table, the work table that she had come to think of as his, even though she had no specific right to think of anything in this citadel as belonging to any particular person yet. He was reading something, leaning back in the chair slightly, One arm crossed over his chest, the other supporting the document he was reading. He looked up when she came in. She crossed the room and she sat in the window seat, which was hers in the same entirely informal way. She took out the reference book she had abandoned the previous afternoon. The room was quiet. Outside, the winter light was flat and pale and even, the kind that meant clouds without rain, the kind that lasted all day and softened everything. She opened the book. He was looking at her. She knew because the quality of the room had the specific quality of being looked at by someone who was not trying to hide that they were looking. She did not look up immediately. He said, "You look like you're thinking about something that isn't in that book." She looked up then. He was watching her with the direct, clear attention that she had spent weeks now learning to receive without bracing against it. It was not surveillance and it was not challenge. It was simply him looking at her the way he looked at things he was genuinely trying to understand. She said, "I was in Marcus's office this morning." Something shifted, very slightly in his expression. Not alarm. The opposite of alarm, actually. The look of someone who has been waiting for a moment and has recognized its arrival. She said, "He told me about the other arrangements." He set down the document in his hand. He said nothing. "You moved quickly," she said. "Yes. And you didn't tell me." "No," he said. The room was still. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the winter light came through the windows and lay across the floor between them. She said, "Why not?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because you were already dealing with enough. And because the reason for doing something and the doing of the thing are not always information that serves the person simultaneously." She sat with that. She thought about being 22 years old and getting into a transport at 7 in the morning with one bag and her mother's ring. She thought about the cold of this citadel's corridors and the silence of the antechamber and the weight of arriving somewhere without having chosen to go there. She thought about 4 words in handwriting she still had not been able to attribute with certainty. She said, "The handwriting at the bottom of the intake documents, was that you?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. She nodded. She looked down at the book in her lap. She turned a page she had not read and was not going to read right now. She said, "It helped." The silence after that had a different quality from every other silence in that room. She was not certain she could describe it with precision. It was the silence of something that had been moving quietly and steadily in one direction for some time, and had reached, not a conclusion, but a place where it was visible. Neither of them said anything else about it. But the afternoon light came through the windows and moved slowly across the floor, and they were both there, and neither of them left. 3 days passed after the library without either of them naming what had been said there. She was not avoiding him, and she did not think he was avoiding her. It was more that the thing they had said, and the things they had not said, required a certain amount of space to breathe in before anything further could be said without risk of saying it wrong. She understood this. She had spent most of her life navigating the distance between what was being said and what was true, and she had developed a sensitivity to the difference. You did not rush these things. You let them settle at their own rate. On the 4th morning, he appeared at the door of the courtyard garden while she was doing what she had taken to doing in the mornings, which was pulling the dead growth from the lavender plants that lined the eastern wall. It was not work she had been asked to do. No one had suggested she tend the garden. But she had grown up gardening and her hands knew what to do with a plant that needed attention, and the lavender had gone unpruned for long enough that it appreciated the intervention. He stood at the door for a moment and watched her. She did not stop what she was doing. He said, "I was going to come and find you." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him, "And instead you found me." "Yes." He came into the garden and stood near the bench and put his hands in his coat pockets in the way he did when he was about to say something he had been thinking about. "I want to tell you something about why I accepted the arrangement. Marcus told me about the other arrangements," she said, "about the other courts. That's part of it," he said. "It's not all of it." She sat back on the cold ground and looked at him. He said, "I had been aware of you before the arrangement was proposed." He said it evenly, with the care of someone who has decided to be honest about something that might be misread, and has decided to be honest anyway. "Through the court's monitoring of the Eastern Territories. Your name came up in connection with Lyra's situation, and after that I had some information about your circumstances. Not detailed. Enough." She was quiet, processing this. Enough for what? Enough to understand that the situation you were in was not one that was going to improve on its own. "The arrangement gave me a mechanism to act." She looked at him steadily. "You arranged for my brothers to sell me." He met her gaze directly. "No. Your brothers decided to make the arrangement on their own. When they came to the court, I was presented with a choice about how to respond. I could have redirected them to the diplomatic resolution that was already underway, and sent them back with nothing. Instead, I accepted the terms they proposed, under conditions I set, and I set those conditions to ensure they were different from what those terms would have looked like with any other court. She thought about this carefully. She turned it around and looked at it from different angles, the way she turned things she needed to understand properly. You didn't create the arrangement, she said. No. But you didn't prevent it either. No, he said. Preventing it would have required me to contact your household before your brothers came to me, to insert myself into your life before I had any standing to do so. He paused. I had no right to do that. She absorbed this. He said, I am not asking you to consider what I did to be right. I'm asking you to understand what it was. She stood up and brushed dirt from her knees. She was taller than people sometimes expected, given the way she moved, which was economical and quiet. Standing, she was at a height where she did not have to tilt her face very much to look at him directly. Why? She said. Why what? Why do you need me to understand what it was? He looked at her, the direct, clear look. Because you deserve to know the facts, and because I would rather you be angry at the right things than at the wrong ones. She stood there in the cold garden between the old lavender and the winter rosemary that his mother had planted 30 years ago, and she thought about what he had just said, and she thought about what it cost a man like him to say it. A man who had the authority to simply not explain himself, to simply be the king and let the king's decisions be their own justification. She said, What did you think was going to happen when I got here? I didn't know, he said. I knew what I had set up. I didn't know what you would make of it. And what did I make of it? Something moved through his expression, something she was beginning to recognize as the specific form his emotion took when he had an honest answer and was deciding whether to give it. He gave it. Something I didn't expect, he said, and something I found I was paying attention to, without meaning to. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about everything, all of it, her brothers and the one bag and the transport and the antechamber and the documents and the 4 words and the library and the courtyard and the way the room felt when both of them were in it, and neither of them was performing anything. She thought about a man who had cataloged thousands of books by how they made him feel and never told anyone, and hadn't expected her to find the logic in it the way she had. She said, I have something I want to say to you. All right? I'm not reconciled to how I ended up here, she said. The fact that you acted in good faith doesn't change the fact that I had no choice. And the fact that things here have been different from what I expected doesn't make the choice that was made for me into something I would have chosen. I know, he said, without qualification and without defense. But, she said, and she felt the weight of the word, the particular weight of a but that is not dismissal, but continuation. I have been figuring out who I am, in a place that wasn't made for me, and didn't ask my permission, and I have found things here that I didn't know I was looking for. And some of that is this garden, and some of that is the library, and some of that is Caroline being more honest with me than she has to be, and some of it, she said, and her voice was even and clear, is you. He looked at her. I'm not certain what to do with that, she said. I'm telling you that it's true. He was very still. He had the quality at this moment of a person who has been carrying something they thought they were going to have to carry alone for a very long time, and has just been told that it has been seen, not fixed, seen. He said, I don't know what to do with it either. Then we're in the same place, she said. They stood in the garden in the cold morning, and the lavender swayed slightly, and the rosemary was green and sharp and alive, and the sky above was the flat, pale gray of a winter without rain. He said, What would you like to happen? She had thought about this, not about this specific question, which she hadn't known he was going to ask, but about the shape of the answer, which she had been working toward since the afternoon in the library, and the stillness of the room, and the 4 words she had been given on her first night. I would like, she said carefully, to have the sort of time that tells you things you can't know quickly, and I would like to have it without either of us pretending to know more or less than we do. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, I think I can do that. She said, I think you can too. A pause, between them, that had warmth in it despite the cold. Not yet the warmth of anything decided, but the warmth of 2 people who have been honest with each other at some cost, and are still standing in the same place. The lavender needs pruning, she said. He looked at the lavender. Yes, it has for a while. I was going to ask if it's all right, for me to do it. It's all right, he said. She crouched back down, and he remained where he was for a moment longer, and then he said, I'll leave you to it, and went back inside. She worked in the garden for another hour and thought about nothing and everything simultaneously. The way you think when your hands are busy and your mind has been given something large to hold. The response from Damon arrived 6 days after she had sent her letter. It was shorter than she had expected. Damon was not, in her experience, a man who used fewer words when more would make him sound more reasonable, and his letter's brevity told her something before she had read its content. She read it once, standing at the desk in her East Wing chambers, and then she put it down. He said that he had not been aware, at the time of the arrangement, that the diplomatic resolution was already underway. He had found out afterward. He said this without apology and without elaboration. He said that the arrangement had been made in Lyra's best interests and that he expected Celine to understand this. He expected her to understand this. She stood at the desk and she held the letter, and she thought about whether she believed him. The first part, the not knowing. She went back and forth on it for several minutes and arrived, honestly, at a conclusion she had not expected. She wasn't certain. She genuinely was not certain whether Damon had known or not. She knew him well enough to know that he was capable of not looking too carefully at information that would have complicated his preferred solution. Not knowing and choosing not to find out were not always different things, but they weren't always the same thing either. She put the letter in the drawer with Lyra's letter and the recipe notebook and the book she had carried from home. She went to find Caroline. Caroline was in the small sitting room off the main corridor that the permanent residents had come to use as a common area, and she was doing some kind of administrative work of her own at the table there. And she looked up when Celine came in, and she read Celine's face with the efficient accuracy of a woman who has been paying close attention to Celine for several weeks. She said, "Sit down, I'll get us something hot to drink." Celine sat down. Caroline came back with 2 cups and sat across from her and said, "What happened?" Celine told her. Not all of it, not the conversation in the garden, not the specific shape of what was developing between her and the king, because that was not yet hers to tell, and she was a person who was careful about what she shared before she was certain of it. But the document, the diplomatic resolution, the letter from Damon. Caroline listened with the complete, focused attention she gave to most things, the kind that asked no clarifying questions because it had understood well enough to follow without them. When Celine finished, Caroline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your brothers made you the price of something without checking whether the price was still required." "Yes," Celine said. "And now?" "Now I know," Celine said, "which is different from not knowing." Caroline looked at her. "What does knowing change?" Celine thought about this honestly. "It changes how much space I give them," she said. "In my head, in my plans." She looked at her cup. "I've been carrying them as people I might need to factor in still. As people I might need to please or manage or justify myself to. Knowing this changes that." "You're letting them go," Caroline said, quietly. "Not as a question." "I'm not cutting them off," Celine said. "They're still my brothers. But I'm stopping carrying them as an obligation and starting carrying them as what they are, which is people who made a specific decision about my value, and who will need to live with that, and who I can love from a significant distance." Caroline was quiet. Then she said, "I think that is one of the most precise things I have ever heard anyone say." Celine picked up her cup and drank from it. The hot drink was something with ginger in it, warming and slightly sharp. "How long have you been at the Citadel?" she asked. 4 years, Caroline said. "What made you stay?" Caroline considered this with the seriousness she gave most questions. "The first year I stayed because I needed to," she said. "The second year I stayed because it had become familiar. The third year I stayed because I had found people worth staying for. The fourth year I stayed because it had become mine, not because I was given it, because I had made it mine." Celine heard that. She heard the specific shape of it, the particular thing Caroline had just told her without directly addressing her at all. She held it. Outside the window of the sitting room, the flat winter sky was beginning to take on the quality of late afternoon, the light shifting from its even pale gray toward something with a little gold at the edges, a grudging and beautiful warmth arriving at the end of a cold day. She thought about the lavender she had pruned that morning. She thought about the fact that she had pruned it without asking, and then asked after, and that the answer had been yes. She thought about what it meant to tend a thing, to learn its shape and need, to make yourself useful to it not because you had been told to but because you had found it, and you knew what it needed, and you were there. She thought about 4 words in handwriting she now knew was his. "You are not alone." She had been not alone before. She had been surrounded by people, all her life, by her brothers, and her stepmother, and Lyra, and neighbors, and the ordinary texture of a household that contained her but did not, at any point she could specifically identify, choose her. This was different. Being not alone and being chosen were different things. She was beginning, carefully and without hurry, to understand what it felt like when the difference was in your favor. They came without announcement. Celine was in the library, which had become the place she went the way certain people go to water, reflexively, when the world required the particular kind of quiet that let her think straight. She had been there for 2 hours reading a book about territorial history that was technically dry but had the quality of something that kept opening unexpected doors, because history written carefully is never really dry. It is simply patient, waiting for you to slow down enough to hear what it is saying. She heard the raised voices from somewhere deeper in the citadel, not shouting, not the specific register of crisis, something more like 2 voices calibrated to project authority, arriving somewhere they had not been invited and choosing volume as their credential. She recognized one of the voices before she was out of the library door. Damon. She stood in the corridor for a moment and she took a breath and she walked toward the sound. They were in the main hall. She arrived at the entrance to find them already in conversation with Edmund, the senior advisor, who had the expression of someone performing patience under conditions that made patience effortful. Damon was doing most of the talking. Rael was standing slightly behind him, as he usually did in these situations, which was the particular formation of a man who agreed with what was being said, but preferred not to be the one held accountable for saying it. And standing to the side, with her hands folded in front of her and her face composed in the exact expression of a person who had not initiated this and did not know how to stop it, was Lyra. Celine stopped at the entrance. Lyra saw her first. Something moved across her face that was relief and distress and apology all arriving at the same moment. The specific expression of someone who has made a decision they are no longer certain was correct but has already set it in motion. Then Damon turned. He looked at her with the expression she knew best from him, the one that was confident in the way of someone who has not yet encountered a situation where his confidence failed him, and therefore still believed it to be an unlimited resource. Celine, he said, the same tone as always. The tone of someone greeting a person who is primarily a variable in their calculation. Damon, she said. She walked into the hall, and Edmund looked at her with the expression of a man who has just realized that the solution to his current problem has arrived without being called for. Rael met her eyes briefly and then looked at the floor, which told her more than anything Damon was about to say. "We came to take you home," Damon said. He said it with the particular confidence of someone who believes that framing determines outcome. Take you home, not discuss your return, not ask whether you want to return. Take home. "I see that," she said. "This arrangement has gone on long enough. Lyra's situation has been resolved." "It was resolved," Celine said, "before I arrived here." Damon's expression did not change exactly, but something behind it recalibrated. A fractional adjustment, the kind you make when you have been prepared for several possible responses and this one was not on the list. The diplomatic channels took time. "The agreement was finalized 3 weeks before your transport came for me," she said. "I've read the court records." Rael looked up from the floor. The main hall was quiet in the way that large stone rooms are quiet when the people in them are very still. Edmund had the expression of a man who is witnessing something he did not organize and cannot leave. Lyra said, softly, "Celine." "I'm not angry," Celine said, to Lyra. And it was true. She was something, but she had spent enough time with what she was to know it was not anger. It was the particular clarity that comes after anger has done its work and passed through. "I'm telling you what's true." She looked at Damon. "I want to understand something," she said, "and I'd like you to be honest with me, which I recognize may not come naturally to you in this specific situation." She said it without heat. "Did you know?" He looked at her. "I told you in the letter that you didn't know at the time of the arrangement." "Yes. I want to ask again, directly, in person." She looked at him steadily. "Did you know?" Damon's jaw set. His eyes moved, briefly, to some point above and past her left shoulder, and then came back. The diplomatic channels were unofficial at the time. There was no guarantee. "That's not an answer," she said. "Celine, the important thing is that you can come home now. This is an important thing too," Rael said, quietly, from his position slightly behind Damon. He knew there were negotiations underway. He didn't know how close they were to resolution. Damon turned to look at him, the specific look of a man who is recalibrating a relationship in real time. Rael looked back at him with the expression of someone who has been making one kind of choice for a long time, and has decided to make a different kind. He said, to Celine, "I should have stopped it, the arrangement. When I found out about the negotiations, I should have told him to wait. I didn't." He paused. "I'm telling you now." She looked at her younger brother, and she thought about him at the kitchen table on the morning this all started, studying the wood grain, not quite meeting her eyes. She thought about the shape of him in her life, always slightly behind, always slightly absent at the precise moment when presence was required. She thought about what it cost him to say what he had just said, in front of Damon. "I know," she said, quietly. Not forgiveness, and not its absence. Just acknowledgement, the honest receipt of something. Damon said, "The point is that you can leave now. The situation has changed. You don't have to stay." "I know I don't have to stay," she said. He opened his hands in the gesture he used when he wanted to indicate that something was obvious. "Then we'll arrange the return. Adelaide or whoever handles logistics here can—" "I didn't say I was going." Silence. She looked at him. She looked at Rael. She looked at Lyra, whose face was doing several things at once, and all of them were honest. She thought about everything she needed to think about, and she said, "I will let you know what I decide. And I will decide it because I have decided it, not because you've arranged a transport." Damon's expression moved through several things quickly. Confusion, because she did not, in his experience, push back this way. Something that might have been the beginning of a realization, unformed. And then, because Damon was fundamentally practical. Recalibration. He could work with this. He would find another angle. She knew him. She said, "You can stay the night. There's a guest wing. Adelaide will arrange it." She walked out of the main hall. She did not go to her chambers, and she did not go to the garden. She went to the corridor on the south side of the building where there was a window seat she had found in her second week, set into the deep stone of the wall, overlooking the eastern approach to the citadel. She sat there and she looked at the landscape and she thought. She thought about home, about what the word meant and what it had meant for the last 22 years and what it meant now. She thought about the kitchen garden and the smaller bedroom and the bread she had made on the morning she was sent away. She thought about Lyra's arms around her in the courtyard and Caroline's steady honesty and Oliver's cheerful, uninvited usefulness and Philip and his stories and the library and the lavender and the way the silence in certain rooms felt like something she had been looking for without knowing she was looking. She thought about a man who wrote 4 words in handwriting at the bottom of a document intended for a woman he had not yet met. She thought about what she had said to him in the garden. She was still there, sitting in the window seat in the south corridor, when the footsteps came. She knew them before she heard them clearly. She had learned the specific quality of them over weeks, the particular pace and weight of someone who moved through space with intention and without hurry. She did not turn around. He sat down in the window seat across from her. The alcove was wide enough for 2, and he looked at the landscape she was looking at. He said, "Adelaide told me they were here. I expected she would. How are you?" She thought about the question. "Clear," she said. "I'm very clear right now, actually." "Is that good?" "I think so. I think clarity is almost always good, even when the things it clarifies are difficult." She looked at the eastern landscape, the long flat territory that she had come from, visible in miniature from this height. Rael admitted he knew about the negotiations. He said he should have stopped the arrangement. He was quiet. "Damon didn't admit it," she said. "But he will, eventually, to himself. People like Damon do their accounting privately." He said, "What do you want to do?" She turned to look at him. He was looking at the landscape, profile, the particular clean line of it, the way he looked when he was not performing anything at all, and was simply being what he was. "I told them I'd decide on my own terms," she said. "Good. I also told them I'm not necessarily going." He did not move. He was very still, the quality of stillness that was attention without expression. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "If I stay, it's because I've decided to stay. Not because I don't have anywhere else to go. I have somewhere else to go. I know exactly where it is, and what it looks like, and what it will and won't offer me." "I understand," he said. "I want you to understand that distinction, because it matters to me. The difference between staying because I'm choosing to, and staying because I have no better option." He turned his head and he looked at her. The direct, steady look that she had come to know as his specific form of full attention. He said, "I understand the distinction, and I want you to know that if you tell me you're going, I will not make it difficult for you. There will be no conditions, and no complications. You can go." She looked at him. He said, "I would prefer you to stay. I want to say that clearly because I don't want to be unclear about something that matters. But I would rather you leave freely than stay in any form of obligation." "Oh, for." She held his gaze. She thought about everything. She thought about the shape of this, the specific shape of a man who had moved quickly to protect a woman he didn't know, and then stepped back and given her room to find herself, who had never once asked her for anything she hadn't offered, who had sat in a cold garden and said he didn't know what to do with what was happening between them, and then done the honest and difficult thing of admitting it anyway. She said, "I know." The evening light was starting to come in from the west now, the cold orange gold of a winter sunset, painting the stone of the window alcove in something warmer than its usual gray. She said, "I'm going to go and speak to Lyra, and then I'm going to sleep on it, in the way that people actually mean when they say they're going to sleep on something, which is not avoiding a decision but letting the decision that's already been made become clear." "All right," he said. She stood up. She looked at him for a moment, sitting in the window seat in the last of the evening light. She said, "You should eat dinner. You look like you've been working since before Adelaide could have told you anything." He looked up at her. The thing behind his eyes that wasn't quite a smile came very close, this time, to actually being one. She went to find Lyra. Lyra was in the guest wing, which Adelaide had arranged with the efficient competence she brought to everything, and she was sitting on the edge of the guest bed, looking like someone who had known for several hours that they had made an error in judgment, but had not yet found the language for it. Celine sat down across from her. Lyra said, "I thought it would help, coming with them. I thought if I was here, I could make sure it went well," Celine said. "Yes, by which you meant make sure I came home." Lyra was quiet. "I thought you'd want to. I thought when you saw us." "Lyra," she said it gently, "look around this room. Look at the quality of the light. Think about what you've seen of this place since you arrived." Lyra looked around the room. Stone walls, warm enough. A window with decent light. The furniture spare but not uncomfortable. Not opulent. Not terrible. "You thought I was suffering," Celine said. "I thought," Lyra stopped. "I thought anyone would want to leave, anywhere they'd been sent without a choice." "You were thinking about what you would feel," Celine said, without judgment in it, "which is what you do." Lyra's face did the thing it did when she was receiving something true that she wasn't certain she had the generosity to accept without defense. She held it this time. She held it and she said, "Yes, I think you're right." "I might leave," Celine said. "I'm not telling you I'm staying. I genuinely haven't decided." Lyra looked at her. "What would make you stay?" Celine thought about the question. "The fact that I haven't decided yet," she said simply. "If I already knew I was going, I'd know by now." Lyra was quiet for a long moment. She looked at her hands. She said, "The king, when he looked at you in the dining room, the last time I was here, he looks at you in a way that I have not seen him look at anyone else in this building." Celine said nothing. "And you," Lyra said, "look at him in a way that is trying very hard to be neutral." Celine said with some accuracy, "You're perceptive when you're paying attention to someone other than yourself." Lyra laughed, startled into it, and it was the sound of someone releasing something they had been holding. "I'm working on that," she said. Celine stayed with her for another hour, and they talked in the way they had always talked when everything else was set aside, and the warmth between them was real, even if it was complicated. And Celine went to bed with the certainty that she would not solve everything tonight, and the peace of knowing she didn't need to. She lay in the East Wing chambers in the dark and she thought about what she was going to do. She thought about it honestly, without rushing it, the way she thought about most things. And in the space of that honest thinking, in the quiet of the old stone building with its cold corridors and its enormous library, and its courtyard garden with 30-year-old rosemary, she found what she already knew. She already knew. She had known for a while. She had been letting herself arrive at the knowing, which was not the same as not knowing. She fell asleep. She slept well. The next morning she asked to meet with him, not through the scheduling office in the South Wing, which was the official channel, and which she had never actually used despite having been told it existed on her first morning. She asked Adelaide to let him know she would like to speak with him when he had time that day, which was a different kind of request, a personal rather than administrative one, and Adelaide received it with the same composed professionalism she brought to everything but with a fractional quality in her expression that suggested she was noting the distinction. He made time at 11. She came to the North Wing, to his working room, which she had been past but never entered. The door was open. He was at the desk, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway and he said, "Come in," with the same voice he used for everything, the even, certain register that she had stopped finding impersonal, several weeks ago. She came in. The room was what she would have predicted, which was itself informative. It was organized the way his mind appeared to be organized, which was thorough and layered. Documents in clear stacks, with a logic she could see even without knowing the specific content. Maps on one wall with notations in small, controlled handwriting. A bookshelf that held fewer books than the library, obviously. But those books were clearly the ones in regular use, worn at the spines and placed without particular concern for aesthetics but with obvious concern for access. On the desk, alongside the documents, a cup of something that had probably been hot earlier in the morning. She sat in the chair across from his desk. He waited. She said, "I want to talk about what happens next." "All right." "I told my brothers last night that I'd have a decision for them this morning," she said. "I've made it." He was very still. He was not performing stillness. It was simply the quality of a person who has learned, over time, that waiting is something you can do with your whole body. She said, "I'm going to tell them I'm staying." Something happened in his face that was not small but was contained, the way large things are contained by people who have made a habit of containment. He said, "All right." "I want to be precise about something," she said. "I am telling you this before I tell them because you are the person it is most relevant to, and because I want you to understand exactly what I'm deciding and exactly what I'm not." He nodded. "I'm staying," she said, "because this has become a place I want to be, because I've found things here that matter to me, because the people here have treated me with a kind of regard I'm not accustomed to, and find I would like to continue having access to." She paused. "And because of you. That's in the list. I'm not putting it last because it matters least. I'm putting it last because it's the most complicated, and I want to be clear about the other things first, so that you understand I'm not staying only because of you." "I understand," he said. "What I'm not deciding," she said, "is anything definitive about what you and I are. I don't know what we are yet. I'm not in a position to know, and I don't think you are either, and I think pretending to know would be worse than admitting we don't." "Yes," he said. "So I'm staying," she said, "and the rest of it will develop at the rate it develops, which I hope will be honestly and without either of us moving faster than the truth allows." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze with the same steadiness she brought to most things she had decided were important. He said, "I want to say something." "Then say it." "When I wrote those words," he said, "at the bottom of the documents, I meant them practically. You were arriving in a place you hadn't chosen, and I wanted you to know you weren't entirely without consideration. But I also wrote them because—" He paused, and she could see him finding the words the way people find things they have not needed to put into language before. "I had been thinking about you as a person before you arrived, enough to have something in my mind that was more than administrative consideration, enough that writing those words was not only practical." She sat with this. "I'm telling you," he said, "because I asked you to have all the facts, and that is a fact." "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They sat in the quiet of the working room, and the 11 o'clock light came through the windows at the particular angle of late winter light, getting stronger now, the days getting imperceptibly longer in the way that February days do, building towards something without being dramatic about it. She said, "I'm going to go and speak to Damon now." She went to find her brothers. They were in the smaller dining room, which surprised her slightly, because it meant they had found the less formal option on their own, or someone had directed them there. Damon was at a table with what appeared to be some kind of documentation he had brought from outside, which was such a Damon thing to do, arrive as a guest in someone else's space and immediately set up a working position, that she felt the brief, strange warmth of recognition. The way you can know someone's irritating habits well enough that they become almost endearing, not because the habits are good but because they are known, and known things carry their own particular feeling. Rael was at the window. She sat down across from Damon. She said, "I'm going to stay." Damon looked at her. His face went through several things quickly, and she watched them all, and felt entirely outside of them, in the specific way of a person who has been making decisions based on other people's feelings for a very long time, and has recently arrived at the discovery that this is optional. "Celine, I've decided," she said. "I want to tell you why, not because you have any claim over the reasons, but because I think it's fair for you to understand." He was quiet. This was not, she could see, what he had prepared for. She said, "I am not going back to a house where I was the person who maintained things and solved problems and managed the spaces between everyone's actual desires. I'm not going back to that, because I have spent time in a place where that is not what I am, and I know now that I can exist differently than I existed there." She said it without cruelty. "I love you, both of you, and I think this decision, the one you made when you sent me here, is one you will account for in your own way and in your own time, and I hope that accounting is honest, but I'm not part of that. That's yours." Rael turned from the window. She looked at him. "I meant what I said yesterday," she told him. "The fact that you said it matters." He nodded. He had the expression of a man who has said the thing he needed to say and is now in the slower process of living with it. Damon said, "This is about the king. This is about me," she said. "Celine, you don't know this man. You've been here 2 months. I know him," she said. Not as a declaration, and not as a defense. As a simple statement of what was true. "I know him in the way you know people you've had genuine conversations with and occupied genuine space alongside. I'm not making a decision about him today. I'm making a decision about myself." Damon looked at her with the expression of a man encountering a version of his sister he has not met before. She saw, in that expression, the edges of something that was not quite respect but was its precursor. The moment before someone adjusts their assessment of a person they thought they had fully categorized. She did not wait for it to complete itself. She said, "You can stay another day if the journey home is long. Adelaide will manage it." She stood up. "Write to me. I'd like to know you're well. Both of you." She left the dining room. She walked through the south wing and into the corridor that ran along the eastern side of the building, and she went out the small stone door into the courtyard garden. The morning was cold and clear, the first genuinely clear sky she had seen in several weeks, blue and bright above the old stone walls. The lavender, which she had pruned 2 weeks ago, was clean and even-edged now, ready for what would come in spring. The rosemary was as it had always been, constant and sharp-smelling, alive in the way that things are alive when they are exactly where they should be. She stood in the garden and she breathed the cold air, and she felt the specific texture of having done something correctly. Not successfully in the sense of having achieved an outcome, but correctly in the sense of having told the truth about what she wanted, and then moved toward it. She had done this rarely in her life. She was going to do it more. After a while she heard the stone door. She did not turn around. She heard the footsteps, the ones she knew, and she waited. He came and stood beside her, and he looked at the lavender. He said, "How did it go?" "Damon is recalibrating his understanding of me," she said. Rael is being honest with himself. Lyra will be all right. She paused. It went the way it needed to. He looked at the rosemary. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said earlier, about the rest of it developing at the rate it develops." "Yes." "I want you to know," he said, in the careful voice of someone for whom this kind of language is not natural and has been arrived at with effort, "that I'm not in a hurry. I have not spent a lot of my life waiting for things. I have generally been someone who identifies what is needed and moves toward it. But I find that with this," he paused, and she heard him find the word, "with you, I am content to do something I rarely do, which is wait for the right time." She looked at him. He was looking at the garden, profile in the clear winter light, the honest face of a man who does not find this kind of speech easy and has given it anyway. She said, "That might be the most revealing thing you've said to me." He looked at her then. "Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "It's the opposite of a problem." The clear blue sky above them was enormous and cold and full of light. A sound reached them from somewhere in the citadel, distant and muffled by stone, that resolved into what Celine recognized as the beginning of the bell in the north wing clock, marking the hour. 11 strokes, steady and certain. They stood in the garden while it finished. She thought about the council meeting that Marcus had mentioned was happening this afternoon, a formal proceeding in the main hall that she had not yet attended but had been curious about. She thought about the book she was going to find in the library when the afternoon was free. She thought about dinner and Caroline's observations, and Oliver's cheerful interference and Philip's stories. She thought about what it meant to have a daily life that was, improbably and without her having planned for it, becoming hers. She said, "What is the council meeting about this afternoon?" He looked at her with the faint, precise expression she had come to recognize as his version of being pleased. "A border allocation in the 4th Territory," he said. "The relevant parties have been disagreeing about it for 18 months. Do they have strong positions?" "They have positions," he said. "Whether they're strong or simply loud is a distinction the meeting will probably establish." She said, "I'd like to observe, if that's allowed." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ward status doesn't include formal council access, but I can designate you as a court observer for this proceeding. It's within my authority." She looked at him. "Is that something you'd do?" "If you want to observe," he said, "yes." She thought about what it meant to be given access to something not because it was part of her official status, not because it was included in her documentation, but because she had asked for it, and the person who could offer it had done so, simply and without complication. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." He nodded. He turned toward the stone door. He paused. He said, without turning fully back to her, "You'll need to find Adelaide before lunch. She handles the observer paperwork." I know where Adelaide is, Celine said. Of course, he said. He went back inside. She remained in the garden for a few minutes longer, alone in the cold blue morning, with her face turned up toward the sky. She stayed there until the cold became the kind that required her to make a decision about continuing to stand in it, and then she made the decision and went back inside. She found Adelaide in the south wing. She filled out the observer documentation. She went to the library and found a book. At 3 o'clock she walked into the main hall with the documentation in her hand, and she found a seat at the side where observers were positioned, and she sat down, and she looked at the room. The council was arranged at the long central table. Senior advisors, territorial representatives, Edmund at one end, Marcus near the middle, and at the head of the table, with the flat, certain authority of someone who has been in this room many times and knows exactly what it requires, the king. He did not look at her when she came in. But after the meeting was called to order and the first territorial representative began making his case, and the room's attention had settled into the focused quality of people doing serious work, he glanced once, briefly, toward the observers section. The scan of the room that he always did, the automatic cataloging of who was where. He found her. His eyes moved on, back to the representative, back to the documentation in front of him. But she had seen, in the fraction of a second before they moved on, the same thing she had been seeing for weeks. The thing that had no formal name in the language of official proceedings or court documentation. The thing that existed only in the unguarded moment before a person returns to being what they are required to be in public. She settled into her chair. She took out the small notebook she had brought to take notes in. She listened to the proceeding with the full attention she gave to most things she found worth understanding. The afternoon passed. She was still there when it ended. Spring arrived at the citadel the way spring arrived in old stone places, not with drama but with a kind of stubborn incremental insistence. First the air changed, losing its deepest cold. Then the light changed, coming in through the corridor windows at an angle that suggested something other than survival. Then things began to bloom in the courtyard garden, things that had been preparation all winter, waiting under the cold ground for the right temperature and the right length of day. And one morning Celine went out and found small yellow flowers along the southern wall that had not been there the evening before. She stood and looked at them for a long time. She was not the same person who had arrived here. She knew this with the practical clarity she brought to things she had examined honestly. She was not transformed in the way of stories where transformation is dramatic and sudden, where people wake up different. She was changed in the way of things that change through use and time, and the specific friction of being genuinely known by a place. She had been shaped by the citadel the way the citadel's corridors had been shaped by decades of feet, quietly and through repetition, and without anyone being able to point to the single day it happened. 4 months. She had been here for just over 4 months when the yellow flowers appeared along the southern wall. She thought about who she had been in the kitchen on the morning her brothers told her. She thought about the bread she had baked and the way she had put the knife in the sink, handle first, careful even then. She thought about the one bag and the transport and the woman who had arrived in that antechamber with nothing decided except that she was going to be practical, because practical was what she had. She still had practical. It had not left her, but she had other things now alongside it. She had the library, which was hers in the way that things become yours when you have spent enough time with them and brought enough of yourself to them. She had the cataloging system, fully understood, regularly used, and once, a few weeks ago, carefully improved in one small section where the logic had developed a gap that she had filled with her own judgment and then noted in the margin. She had found the note still there the next time she visited that section. No one had changed it back. She had Caroline, who had become the kind of friend she had not known she needed, which was the kind who told you the truth and expected it in return, and did not require you to perform comfort at her. She had Oliver, who was incapable of walking past a problem without addressing it, and who had therefore addressed approximately 40 things in Celine's daily life over the past months. Not because she had asked, but because he noticed them, and had the means to fix them, and the absence of hesitation about doing so. She had Philip, who was funny in the way that old people who have watched a great many things from a very particular vantage point are funny, which is to say unexpectedly and with perfect timing. She had the garden. And she had this, the daily texture of a man who was, she had concluded over the course of 4 months of honest observation, someone she trusted. Trust was not a word she had arrived at quickly. She had arrived at it the way she arrived at most conclusions, by testing it repeatedly with evidence and refusing to confirm it before the evidence was sufficient. He had been given, over the course of those months, numerous opportunities to be something other than what he appeared to be. She had watched him in the council room, in the main hall, in the corridors, in the library, and the garden, She had watched him with his advisors and with staff and with territorial representatives and with people who had power and people who didn't. She had watched him when he thought no one was specifically watching him, and she had watched him when he knew she was. He was consistent, not in the way of someone performing consistency, not in the way of someone who had decided on a version of themselves and was maintaining it. Consistent in the way of someone who simply was a particular thing throughout. She had told him this, one evening in the library, in the direct way she had of saying things she had decided were worth saying. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've had a lot of time to determine what I'm not willing to be." He said it plainly, not as a statement of virtue, as a fact of history. She had looked at him. "What were you not willing to be?" He had said simply, "My father." She had not asked him to elaborate. She had stored it in the way she stored things that would open in their own time, when he was ready to offer them and she was ready to receive them. She was getting better at knowing the difference between a thing that needed to be pressed on immediately and a thing that needed to be held and waited for. She was sitting in the garden looking at the yellow flowers when he appeared at the stone door. This had become a thing that happened, she had noticed, not by design but by the accumulated habit of two people who had independently formed the habit of being in the same place at the same time. He came to the garden in the mornings often now. He worked on the bench sometimes, which she had not known he did until she arrived one morning to find him there with a sheaf of documents and a coffee that had clearly been brought from somewhere inside. He had not looked apologetic about being there. She had sat down on the other end of the bench and opened the book she had brought, and they had worked in comfortable parallel until Adelaide came looking for him at 10. He came through the stone door now, and he looked at the yellow flowers, and he came to stand beside her. "My mother planted those," he said. "The ones along the south wall? And the bulbs in the east corner, they come up later, in March, dark purple." She looked at the yellow flowers. She thought about a woman she had never met who had planted things in this garden 30 years ago that were still, reliably, every spring, being exactly what she had planted them to be. She must have loved this garden, she said. "She spent a lot of time in it," he said. "I used to sit on that bench and watch her work." She talked while she gardened. Not to me specifically, just into the air. He paused. She talked about what things needed, what the lavender needed, and what the rosemary needed, and what the bulbs needed, like she was thinking out loud about the problem of keeping things alive. Celine looked at him. He was looking at the yellow flowers. "You don't talk about her often," she said. "No. Is that because it's painful, or because you don't have the habit?" He was quiet for a moment. "Both," he said. "It was painful for a long time, and then it became a habit not to, and now I'm not always sure which is which." She said, "You could build a different habit." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I think I could." They stood together in the morning spring light, and she thought about things that get planted and grow for 30 years and still bloom reliably. And she thought about habits that form around pain and then outlast it. And she thought about what it means to begin a new habit with someone standing beside you. She said, "I want to tell you something." "All right." "When I arrived here," she said, "I made a decision. Not about this place and not about you. About myself. I decided I was going to stop organizing my life around the preferences and comfort of people who hadn't earned the right to those accommodations." She looked at the flowers. "I have been doing that, mostly. But there are still moments where I find myself about to defer to something out of habit, rather than choice. About to make myself smaller. About to not say the thing. What's the thing you're not saying?" She looked at him. Clear morning light, the kind that does not allow for anything less than honest. "I have stopped treating what I feel about you as a thing to be managed," she said. "I've stopped keeping it at a careful distance, the way I was keeping it at the beginning. And I want you to know that because I think you've been careful about not moving faster than I was ready for, and I want to tell you that I've moved." He looked at her with the full, direct, completely unguarded attention that she had come to understand was his version of being completely open. He said, "Where have you moved to?" She said, "Somewhere I would like to stay, if the position is available." Something happened in his face that she had not seen there before. Not the thing that wasn't quite a smile. Something that was fully what it was. Something that had been waiting behind everything else for long enough that its arrival had a quality of returning, of coming back to a room it had left a long time ago. He said, "It is." The garden was very quiet. The yellow flowers were bright in the spring light. Somewhere above them a bird had arrived in the old stones at the top of the eastern wall and was saying something persistent and cheerful about the fact that it was morning. She said, "I'm going to need time." "I know. Not because I'm uncertain, because time is how trust becomes certain, and I'm building something that I want to be certain about." "I know," he said again. "I want the same thing." She nodded. She looked at the flowers. She looked at the rosemary, green and constant, the way it had been all winter, and the lavender she had pruned in the cold months, now beginning to put out new growth along the ends of each branch, small and gray-green and determined. She said, "Tell me about your mother." He looked at her. "You said she talked into the air while she gardened," she said. "What did she say?" He was quiet for a moment. She waited, in the way she had learned to wait, without requiring anything of the silence while it lasted. Then, slowly, he began to talk. He told her about his mother, whose name was Nora, who had grown up in the Southern Territory before coming to the Citadel as a young woman, who had loved two things with equal passion, which were this garden and a very specific kind of honey cake that she made on Sundays, and who had died when he was 17 in the winter that had followed the hardest year he had known until then. He told her these things in the measured, careful way of someone who has not often spoken about something and is finding, in the speaking, that the words are more available than they had expected. She listened without asking questions. She knew when to ask and when to simply receive what was being offered. When he was done, when the story had arrived at the natural place where it did not need to continue to be complete, they were quiet together for a while. She said, "She sounds like someone who understood what things needed." "Yes," he said, "she did." "So do you," Celine said. "I think she left that in you." He looked at her. The clean, clear morning light fell across both of them, and the garden was green and yellow and alive after the long winter. She put her hand beside his on the cold stone of the garden wall, not taking his hand, just placing hers near enough that the warmth of proximity was present. He looked down at their hands. He turned his and placed it over hers, briefly, once, and then he moved it back. That was all. It was everything. She thought about the kitchen in the house she had grown up in, and the bread she had made on the morning she was told, and the one bag and the transport, and the 20 minutes in the antechamber with the stone floor and the straight-backed chair, and the folder of documents. She thought about the journey from what she had been to where she was standing now. She thought about 4 words in careful handwriting at the bottom of the first document she had received in this place. "You are not alone." She was not alone. She had arrived at that truth slowly, and without fanfare, the way you arrive at most things that are actually true, by living inside them long enough to recognize them for what they were. She was not going to say this out loud. Not today, not in the garden with the yellow flowers his mother had planted and the spring light doing what spring light did, which was make everything look briefly possible. It was too complete a thing to say out loud when it had just arrived at its full shape. She wanted to hold it for a day first. She would tell him tomorrow. She would tell him tomorrow in the library, probably, or in the corridor on the south side, or in this garden, or in the smaller dining room over something with ginger in it. She would tell him simply and clearly, the way she said most things now, because she had stopped keeping distance from the things she actually meant. She would tell him tomorrow. Today she stood in the garden with the spring light on her face and the warmth of someone beside her, and the knowledge of what she was going to say, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, simply where she was. The bird on the eastern wall said its piece and flew. The lavender moved in the spring air. The yellow flowers his mother had planted 30 years ago were bright along the southern wall. She breathed in, and she breathed out, and she stayed. She told him in the library. She had known it would be the library, had known it even when she told herself yesterday that it might be the corridor or the garden or the dining room. She had known because the library was the place she had first allowed herself to be fully herself in this building, the first room she had walked into without a plan and without performance, and it seemed right that the thing she was going to say should be said there. She went at 10 in the morning, the same hour she usually went, and she did not bring a book. He was already there. He was at the table near the windows, the one she had always thought of as his, with a document in front of him, and his coffee beside it, and the morning light coming through the tall windows in the way it came through in spring now, stronger and warmer than it had been all winter. A different quality of light entirely. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at him. He looked up. She came in. She sat down across from him at the table, the work table, which was not where she usually sat. She usually sat in the window seat. Sitting at the table was a different kind of being here, a more direct kind, and he noticed. She could see him notice. He put down the document. She said, "I told you yesterday that I'd moved somewhere and I wanted to stay there." "Yes," he said. "I want to be more specific today," she said, "about where I've moved to and what it is." She put her hands flat on the table, the same way she had put her hand flat against the window glass on her first night here. A different glass and a different cold and a different Celine than the one she was now. "I am in love with you," she said. "I want to say that plainly, Because I think plainness is what this deserves, and because I've spent too much of my life not saying the things that were true, and I'm not going to do that with this." He was very still. She looked at him steadily. "I know what love means to me," she said. "I've thought about it carefully, which you would expect. It's not a sudden thing, and it's not a performance. It's the result of 4 months of paying genuine attention to someone who was worth paying genuine attention to." She paused. "That's what it is. I wanted you to know." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she felt the specific texture of having said a true and irreversible thing and waiting for its landing. Then he said, "I have been carrying the same thing since approximately the 3rd week you were here, and have not said it because I was not certain I had the right to." She looked at him. "What changed your certainty?" "You did," he said. "Yesterday, in the garden." He was looking at her with complete, open attention. "You told me you'd moved, and I understood that to mean you'd moved in a direction that included me, and that understanding made the question of whether I had the right seem considerably less important than the question of whether I was going to say the true thing while I had the chance to." She sat with this. She thought about a man who had been careful with her from the beginning, more careful than she had initially understood, and who had continued to be careful even as the situation between them developed into something that required a different kind of care. She thought about what it had cost him to remain at the pace she needed while carrying something he was not saying. She said, "I wish you'd said it sooner." "I know," he said. "I was afraid of the wrong thing." "What were you afraid of?" He said, "That it would change what we had been building, that saying it too early would make it into a pressure rather than a truth." He paused. "I was wrong about that. The pressure was already there. Naming it would have reduced it." She said, "You could name it now." He looked at her. He said, "I love you." He said it the way he said most things, without adornment and without apology, in the plain, certain register of someone who does not say things they don't mean, and means this completely. "I have been in love with you, I think, since the afternoon you sat in the library for the first time, and chose a book from the section I was most interested in, and didn't ask me any questions about it." She felt the warmth of that, the specific warmth of being known in the precise way you most need to be known. She said, "The difficult but rewarding section." Yes. She sat with it. She sat with all of it. The words and their particular weight, and the man across the table, and the morning light through the tall windows, and the 4 months of daily texture that had accumulated into this. She sat with it the way she sat with most things she needed to receive properly, without rushing past it to the next thing. Then she said, "What do we do now?" He looked at her, the expression she loved, because she could never quite describe it, the thing behind the eyes. "I was hoping you'd know," he said. "You seem better at practical steps." She laughed. She had not expected to laugh, and it arrived without warning, and the sound of it in the library, in that particular quiet room, felt like something opening. He looked at her, with an expression she had no prior words for. She was going to need new ones. She said, "The practical step is that we have this conversation with some regularity and in good faith, and without either of us deciding on behalf of the other what the other is feeling or needing." "That sounds manageable," he said. "It is manageable. It requires honesty and patience, and the specific willingness to be corrected when you're wrong about something." "I've been corrected before," he said. "I've survived it." "The willingness to be corrected by me specifically," she said, "which is a different proposition." Something moved through his face, the same thing that had moved through it yesterday in the garden, the thing she did not yet have the right word for. "I am willing," he said, "to be corrected by you specifically, in perpetuity." "Good," she said. "That's settled then." She stood up. He looked up at her. She said, "I'm going to get a book. I've been coming here without a book, and I find the absence of a book in the library to be philosophically uncomfortable." "Which section?" he said. "I was thinking about the section in the northeast corner," she said. "The one that took me until last week to find the underlying logic of." He was very still. "What logic did you find?" "Books that are ostensibly about one thing but are actually about another," she said. "Histories that are really about memory. Adventure stories that are really about grief. Love stories that are really about people trying to understand what they're allowed to want." She looked at him. "That section." He looked at her steadily for a long moment. "That's the section I added last," he said. "Most people can't find the logic." "I found it," she said. "Yes," he said. "You did." She went to the northeast corner, and she found the book she had been working toward all week, a history that was really about how places hold the people who have lived in them, how stone remembers, how old ground keeps its record, in ways that take patience to read. She took it back to the window seat, the seat that was hers in the same informal and entirely real way that the library itself had become hers, and she sat down. He returned to his work. The room was the same room it had always been, old stone and tall windows and centuries of accumulated reading on the shelves, and the morning light doing what spring light did. The document on his table was the same kind of document it was always some version of, the ongoing work of a territory that did not stop requiring management because a person's internal life had become clearer. She opened her book. She read. At some point, she was not certain when, he got up and came and sat in the window seat. Not the full window seat, which had two sides and a gap of several inches between them. His side. She looked up from the book. He had a document in his hand, but he was not looking at it. He was looking at the lavender in the courtyard below, which was fully awake now in the spring, and the yellow flowers his mother had planted along the southern wall. She looked at the garden too. After a while she said, "Adelaide is going to notice." "Adelaide already knows," he said. "Adelaide knows everything. Is that going to be a problem, officially?" He turned and looked at her. "No," he said. "I have the authority to make it not a problem. I've been waiting to use that authority until it was actually relevant." "And now it's relevant?" "Yes," he said. She looked at him. She said, "There are going to be people in this court who have opinions about this." "Yes. And people in the territories who have opinions." "Yes. And my brothers," he said, without any particular expression. "Your brothers can have whatever opinions they choose. They have already had one significant opinion about your life, and have lost the credibility to make a second one unexamined." She looked at him. He said, "That was perhaps too direct." "No," she said. "That was exactly the right amount of direct." He turned back to the window. A small sound came from him that was the particular cousin of the thing behind the eyes that wasn't quite a smile, a sound she had not heard before, and it took her a moment to understand that it was him being briefly, genuinely amused at his own directness. She turned back to her book. They sat in the window seat for the next 2 hours, and the spring light moved across the floor, and the lavender moved in the garden below, and she read her history that was really about how places hold the people who have lived in them, and she thought about what it meant for a place to hold you. She had been held by the kitchen of a house that had used her labor and called it love. She had been held by the idea of a family that had found her convenient and called it belonging. She was being held, now, by old stone and library shelves, and a garden planted by a woman she had never met, and a man who had catalogued 1,000 books by how they made him feel, and had looked at her from the first moment, with the quiet, complete attention of someone who was not going to look away. That was different. That was the kind of being held that did not require you to make yourself smaller to fit. She thought about all the things she had been told, implicitly and explicitly, about what she was. The capable one, the practical one, the one who managed things, the one who would understand, the one who could be relocated when relocation was convenient. She thought about who she was here. She was the one who found the logic in the northeast section that most people couldn't find. She was the one who pruned the lavender in winter because it needed it, and no one else had thought to. She was the one who asked for observer status in the council meeting, and then took notes, and then used those notes in a conversation with Marcus 3 days later, that had apparently startled Marcus in the pleasant way, the way of someone receiving unexpected competence from an unexpected direction. She was the one who was sitting in the window seat of the library in the spring light, with the man she loved on the other end of the seat, and her book open and the day ahead of her, and nothing requiring her to be smaller than she was. She turned a page. She read. She was, she thought, in the precise and careful way she thought about things she wanted to be certain of, exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because she had been sent here, not because she had no choice, because she had found it and recognized it and chosen it. The day was long and warm with spring and full of the ordinary texture of a life that was, finally, hers. Outside, in the courtyard garden, the lavender moved in the light wind, and the yellow flowers were bright along the southern wall, and the rosemary was green and constant and alive. Things planted in the right place, in the right ground, by someone who understood what they needed, do not merely survive, they stay.